When a struggling single father is summoned to the CEO's office at a company known for silent terminations, he prepares to lose everything: his job, his home, his ability to care for his grieving son. But Victoria Cross, the ruthless executive everyone fears, isn't about to fire him. She's about to resurrect the one thing that could have saved his wife's life. And she's been watching him far more closely than he ever imagined. Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city name so I can see how far this journey travels across the world. The fluorescent lights in the hallway seemed dimmer than usual, or perhaps it was just Ethan Cole's vision tunneling as he walked toward the executive floor. Each step on the polished tile echoed like a countdown. His throat felt tight, his palms damp despite the building's aggressive air conditioning. The email had arrived at 8:47 a.m., 3 sentences that had drained the color from his face. Ethan, please come to my office at 9 a.m. Come alone. Victoria Cross. At Helix Innovations, a summons to Victoria Cross's office was the corporate equivalent of a death sentence. People whispered about it in break rooms, their voices dropping to funeral tones. Jenny from accounting had received the call last month. Her desk was cleared by noon, her login credentials deactivated before she'd even finished crying in the parking lot. Marcus from IT never made it back from his meeting. Security had escorted him out with a cardboard box of his belongings, his face ashen. The pattern was unmistakable. You went up to the 23rd floor, and you didn't come back down employed. Ethan checked his phone for the 100th time. 8:58 a.m. His son's school photo stared back at him from the lock screen. Oliver, at 7 years old, gap-toothed smile, eyes that still carried a shadow that hadn't been there before his mother died. The photo had been taken 3 months ago, 2 months after Sarah's funeral, and Ethan could see the change in his boy even then. The grief counselor said it would take time. Time required stability. Stability required money. Money required this job, the job he was about to lose. His record over the past 11 months was indefensible. He knew that. 17 late arrivals, 12 early departures, 8 sick days, most of them not for his own illness, but for Oliver's nightmares, his stomach aches, his desperate pleas not to be left alone. Just last week, Ethan had left in the middle of a client presentation because the school nurse called about Oliver's panic attack. His supervisor, Martin Chen, had looked at him with a mixture of pity and exasperation that had made Ethan's stomach turn. "I understand what you're going through," Martin had said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But I can't keep covering for you. The numbers are slipping. The team is picking up your slack. At some point, Ethan, I have to think about everyone else." That conversation had been 4 days ago. Now here he was, being called to the top floor. The elevator ride felt interminable. Ethan stood alone in the mirrored compartment, confronting his reflection. 36 years old, but looking older, suit that needed pressing, tie slightly crooked, dark circles under hazel eyes that had once been bright with ambition. When had he stopped caring about his appearance? When had survival become his only goal? The elevator chimed, 23rd floor. The executive suite was a different world, where the lower floors hummed with the ambient noise of keyboards and conversations. Up here, everything was muffled, refined, cold. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, steel and glass towers stretching toward a gray November sky. The reception area featured a single desk manned by a woman whose nameplate read Diane Rothschild, executive assistant. She was in her 50s, impeccably dressed, with the kind of neutral expression that suggested she'd witnessed countless professional executions without flinching. "Mr. Cole," she said, her voice crisp and efficient. "Miss Cross is expecting you. Please go right in." No small talk, no reassuring smile, just a gesture toward the frosted glass door that bore Victoria Cross's name in severe modern lettering. Ethan's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the handle. This was it. In a few minutes, he'd be jobless. The rent was already 3 weeks overdue. His landlord, a perpetually annoyed man named Costas, who owned half the apartment buildings in the neighborhood, had left 2 messages this week, each one more pointed than the last. The electricity bill sat unopened on the kitchen counter because Ethan couldn't bear to see another red warning notice. Oliver needed new shoes. His toes were cramping in the old ones, but Ethan had been putting it off, hoping to stretch his paycheck just a little further. And now there would be no paycheck. He pushed open the door. Victoria Cross's office was exactly what he'd expected. Massive, minimalist, intimidating. A glass desk that looked like it belonged in a museum dominated the space. Its surface empty except for a single laptop and a thin folder. Behind it, the woman herself stood with her back to him, silhouetted against the floor-to-ceiling windows, hands clasped behind her back as she gazed out at the city below. She didn't turn around. "Close the door, Mr. Cole." Her voice was measured, controlled, with the kind of authority that made compliance automatic. Ethan closed the door, the soft click seeming unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He remained standing, unsure whether to approach the desk or wait for permission. "Sit down." He moved to one of the two chairs facing her desk, lowering himself carefully, as if afraid the furniture might reject him. The leather was butter soft, expensive. Everything in this room whispered power and permanence, the kind of security Ethan had once taken for granted and now couldn't imagine ever feeling again. Victoria Cross turned around, and Ethan saw her clearly for the first time. She was in her mid-40s, he guessed, with dark hair pulled back in a style that suggested no tolerance for distraction. Sharp cheekbones, pale skin, eyes the color of slate. She wore a charcoal suit that was perfectly tailored, not a thread out of place. There was something almost sculptural about her presence, elegant but cold, beautiful in the way a marble statue is beautiful. Untouchable. She regarded him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she moved to her desk, opened the thin folder, and began reading aloud. October 3rd, 9:42 a.m. arrival. October 7th, 9:31 a.m. arrival. October 15th, departed at 2:17 p.m. October 22nd, sick day. October 29th, 10:03 a.m. arrival. She looked up. "Should I continue?" Ethan's mouth had gone dry. "No, ma'am." "I have 11 months of this data, Mr. Cole. 11 months of declining performance, missed deadlines, and what my HR department politely calls attendance issues." She closed the folder with a precise snap. "You were once one of our most promising analysts. Your work on the Patterson account was exemplary. Your efficiency ratings were in the 98th percentile, and now," she gestured at the folder as if it contained something distasteful, "now you're barely functional." Each word was a stone added to the weight already crushing Ethan's chest. He wanted to defend himself, to explain, but what could he say that would matter? The facts were the facts. He was failing, had been failing for months. "I know," he managed. "I know my performance has been unacceptable," Victoria finished. "The word you're looking for is unacceptable, Mr. Cole." He nodded, staring at his hands. This was it. The blow was coming. He braced himself for it, for the words that would end everything. "Tell me why." Ethan's head snapped up. "What?" "Tell me why your performance has deteriorated." Victoria leaned back in her chair, her expression unchanged. "I'm not interested in corporate euphemisms or vague excuses. I want the truth." The truth. The truth was an 11-month-old nightmare that he lived every single day. The truth was waking at 2 a.m. to find Oliver standing beside his bed, tears streaming down his face, asking why Mommy wasn't coming back. The truth was burnt toast and forgotten lunchboxes and parent-teacher conferences where he nodded along while feeling like a fraud because he had no idea how to be both parents. The truth was collapsing into bed each night knowing he was failing at everything: work, fatherhood, life itself. "My wife died," Ethan said quietly. 11 months ago." Victoria's expression didn't change. "I'm aware. Sarah Cole. Sepsis resulting from an undiagnosed infection. She was 34. The clinical summary of Sarah's death landed like a slap. Ethan felt anger flash through him. How dare this woman reduce his wife to a statistic? But it died almost instantly, replaced by exhaustion. What was the point of anger? What was the point of anything? "I have a son," he continued, his voice hollow. "Oliver. He's 7. He doesn't understand why his mother isn't here. Some days he's angry. Some days he's just empty. The school counselor says it's normal, that grief manifests differently in children, but watching him struggle, Ethan's throat constricted. I'm all he has. So when he can't sleep, I don't sleep. When he's sick, I stay home. When he breaks down in the middle of the school day, I leave work. I know it's not professional. I know it's not fair to my team. I know I'm not the employee you hired, but he's my son, and he needs me, and I don't know how to do this any other way." Silence filled the office. Victoria Cross sat perfectly still, her hands folded on the desk, her face an impenetrable mask. Ethan waited for judgment, for the inevitable dismissal, for his entire fragile world to finally shatter. "You're right," Victoria said at last. "You're not the employee we hired. The Ethan Cole we hired was brilliant, focused, and reliable. That man no longer exists." Ethan closed his eyes. "Here it comes." "However," Victoria continued, and something in her tone made him look up again, "you're also not the liability my HR department believes you to be." Confusion flickered across Ethan's face. "I don't understand." Victoria opened her laptop, tapped a few keys, then turned the screen toward him. It showed a security log, timestamps, and entries in neat columns. "Do you know what this is?" Ethan leaned forward, scanning the data. His stomach dropped. These are my access records." "Indeed. Every time you badge into the building, every time you access the network, every door you pass through, standard security protocol." She scrolled down. "Notice anything interesting about Saturday nights?" He did notice. The pattern was unmistakable. Nearly every Saturday for the past 6 months showed him badging in around 8 p.m. and leaving around 2 a.m. "You've been coming in on weekends," Victoria said, "late at night when the building is nearly empty. You set up a makeshift workspace in conference room 7B, I assume because it's on a quiet floor and no one bothers you there. You've been completing your work after hours when your son is asleep and you can focus without interruption." Ethan felt heat rise to his face. He had been careful, or so he thought. He told himself that if he could just catch up on weekends, just stay ahead of the deadlines, maybe no one would notice how much he was struggling during regular hours. Apparently, he'd been wrong. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have asked permission. I didn't think—" "You didn't think anyone was paying attention," Victoria interrupted. "You thought you were invisible, flying under the radar, barely holding on." She closed the laptop. "You were wrong." The words hung in the air between them. Ethan didn't know what to say, didn't know what this meant. Was she angry that he'd been using company resources after hours? Was this another infraction to add to his growing list of failures? "I've been watching you, Mr. Cole," Victoria said, and there was something in her voice now, something almost soft. "Not just your badge records. I've reviewed your weekend work. The analysis you completed for the Hendricks project was exceptional. The system optimization you proposed for our client database was innovative. The presentation you built for Martin's team was far superior to anything they'd produced in the previous quarter. You've been doing the work of 2 people, badly during the day, brilliantly at night." Ethan stared at her, completely lost. "I don't understand what you're telling me." Victoria stood, moving to the window again. When she spoke, her voice was quieter, almost contemplative. 3 weeks ago, I came to the office late on a Saturday night. I'd forgotten an important file and needed to retrieve it. When I got off the elevator on the 7th floor, I saw a light on in conference room 7B. I looked inside. She paused, and Ethan held his breath. "You were at the table working on your laptop, and on the couch against the wall, your son was asleep under your jacket. He had a stuffed animal, a rabbit, I think. You'd set up a pillow from somewhere, made him as comfortable as you could, and you were working with headphones on so you wouldn't wake him." The memory crashed over Ethan. That Saturday. Oliver had woken from a nightmare and refused to be left alone, even with Mrs. Kowalski from downstairs who sometimes babysat. The Hendricks deadline was looming, and Ethan had been desperate. So he'd brought Oliver to the office, settled him on the couch, and worked through the night while his son slept fitfully nearby. "I stood there for 5 minutes," Victoria continued, still facing the window, "watching you work, watching you look over at your son every few minutes to make sure he was still sleeping. You had this expression on your face, this mixture of determination and desperation and love. And I thought to myself, here is a man at the absolute edge of his capacity, doing everything he possibly can to not fail the people who depend on him." Ethan's vision blurred. He blinked rapidly, fighting back tears. He couldn't break down here, not in front of the CEO, not when he still didn't understand where this conversation was going. Victoria turned back to face him. I didn't fire you then, Mr. Cole, and I'm not firing you now. The relief was so sudden and overwhelming that Ethan actually gasped. You're not? No, but this meeting isn't about your performance record or your attendance issues. Those are symptoms of a larger problem, and I believe I have a solution. She returned to her desk, extracted another folder, this one thicker, and placed it in front of him. Before we discuss that solution, I need you to understand something about why you're here at Helix Innovations in the first place. Ethan frowned, opening the folder. Inside were documents he recognized. The acquisition agreement from 18 months ago, when Helix had purchased MedTech Solutions, the small medical technology startup where he'd been working. The buyout had been unexpected but lucrative for the founders. For employees like Ethan, it had meant a transition to a larger company, better benefits, more security. Security he desperately needed, especially when Sarah got sick. You remember MedTech Solutions? Victoria said. It wasn't a question. Of course. I worked there for 4 years before the acquisition. And do you remember what you were working on in the final 6 months before we bought the company? Ethan's frown deepened as he tried to recall. That period had been chaotic. Sarah's health had already been declining, though they hadn't known why yet. He'd been juggling doctor's appointments and mysterious symptoms, and a project that he'd been passionate about, but that had ultimately been shelved due to budget constraints. The early detection system, he said slowly. The AI diagnostic tool for hospital networks. More specifically, it was designed to identify patterns in patient data that might indicate developing infections before they became critical. The algorithm could analyze vital signs, lab results, medication responses, and flag potential sepsis cases hours or even days before traditional methods. The memory was bitter. We called it Sentinel, but MedTech didn't have the resources to develop it properly. The investors wanted to focus on more immediately profitable products. We shelved it. You didn't shelve it, Victoria corrected. You were forced to abandon it. I've read the internal emails. You fought for that project. You believed in it. I did, Ethan admitted. Sepsis kills over 270,000 people a year in the U.S. alone. Most of those deaths are preventable with early intervention. Sentinel could have saved lives. But it needed clinical trials, partnerships with hospitals, FDA approval processes that would take years and millions of dollars. It was never going to happen at a small startup. He looked up at Victoria, confusion evident on his face. Why are we talking about this? Victoria's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in her gray eyes. MedTech Solutions had 7 different technology projects in development when we acquired the company. Do you know which one interested Helix Innovations enough to trigger the acquisition? The implication hit Ethan like a physical blow. Sentinel? Sentinel, Victoria confirmed. Everything else, the remote monitoring devices, the patient portal software, even your impressive client database architecture, was secondary. We wanted Sentinel. We wanted your algorithm, your research, your vision, and we wanted the man who created it. Ethan sat back in his chair, stunned. But why? Helix isn't a medical company. You do corporate IT solutions, business intelligence, data analytics. We did, Victoria interrupted. Past tense. Helix Innovations has been diversifying. 3 years ago, we established a medical technology division. We've been quietly building partnerships with hospital networks, research institutions, and regulatory consultants. We've been preparing infrastructure for exactly the kind of long-term, high-impact project that MedTech Solutions couldn't support. She leaned forward, and for the first time, Ethan saw something other than cold professionalism in her face. He saw intensity, purpose. We've been building Sentinel, Mr. Cole. For the past 18 months, we've been developing your project, and it works. The words didn't make sense, couldn't make sense. That's impossible. The complexity alone would require years of development. We had your original research, your algorithms, your documentation, and we had resources you never dreamed of at MedTech. Victoria opened her laptop again, pulled up a series of graphs and data visualizations. We conducted a pilot program at Mercy General Hospital. 6 months, 2,400 patients. Sentinel identified 37 potential sepsis cases, an average of 14 hours before traditional monitoring systems. 29 of those patients received early intervention, All 29 survived. In a control group without Sentinel, the survival rate for similar cases was 63%. Ethan stared at the data, his mind reeling. The numbers were extraordinary, better than he'd hoped when he first designed the system. This is incredible. It's your work, Mr. Cole, refined and implemented, yes, but fundamentally yours. And now we're ready to scale it. We have partnerships with 17 hospital networks across 8 states. We have FDA approval for expanded trials. We have funding, infrastructure, and momentum. Victoria paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that made Ethan's breath catch. What we don't have is the right person to lead it. The office seemed to tilt. Lead it? The project needs someone who understands the technology at a fundamental level, someone who has the vision to guide its development, someone who has a personal stake in seeing it succeed. Victoria's gaze was steady, unwavering. I'm offering you the position of Director of Medical AI Development. You would oversee the Sentinel rollout, manage the development team, coordinate with our hospital partners, and ensure the system fulfills its potential. Full benefits, salary increase of 40%, flexible work arrangements to accommodate your family's situation, and a dedicated support staff to handle the administrative burden. Ethan couldn't speak, couldn't process what he was hearing. This morning, he'd walked into this office expecting to be fired, and now he was being offered a promotion, a leadership position, the chance to resurrect the project he'd mourned as a lost dream. Why? The word came out as barely more than a whisper. Why me? There must be dozens of people more qualified, people who haven't spent the last year falling apart, because you understand what's at stake, Victoria said, and now her voice carried an edge of something Ethan couldn't identify. Not quite emotion, but close. You understand that this isn't just about technology or profit margins or corporate success. You understand that every hour we delay, someone dies from a preventable infection. Someone's wife, someone's father, someone's child. She paused, and Ethan saw her jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. You understand because you've lived it. The mention of Sarah hit him like it always did, a sharp, unexpected pain in his chest. My wife died from sepsis. If Sentinel had existed and been implemented in her hospital's system, the algorithm would have flagged her declining condition approximately 18 hours before her septic shock became critical, Victoria said quietly. I've reviewed her medical records with the appropriate permissions from her estate. The patterns were there, subtle but detectable. Sentinel would have caught it. Ethan felt something break loose inside him. All the grief, all the guilt, all the what-ifs that had haunted him for 11 months suddenly had a shape, a name, a possibility that was both agonizing and unbearable. Sarah could have been saved. The technology to save her had existed, locked away in his own abandoned research, waiting for resources that hadn't come in time. I didn't know, he said, his voice cracking. I never even thought to... You were focused on keeping your wife alive, not running diagnostic simulations on data you no longer had access to, Victoria said. The guilt you're feeling right now is irrational and unproductive. Sarah's death was a tragedy, but it wasn't your fault. What you can do now is ensure that other families don't experience the same loss. Ethan looked down at his hands, blinking hard against tears. Everything Victoria was offering, the position, the resources, the chance to make a difference, was more than he'd imagined possible. But beneath the hope, beneath the sudden rush of purpose, there was a question he couldn't ignore. Why were you watching me? He asked, looking up. You said you'd been monitoring my performance, my weekend work. You were in the building that night and you saw me with Oliver. This is more than standard managerial oversight. Why do you care this much about what happens to me? For the first time since the conversation began, Victoria's composure cracked. Just for a moment, a brief tightening around her eyes, a slight downward pull at the corners of her mouth. But it was enough. Enough to show that beneath the ice-cold executive exterior, there was something human, something wounded. Because I know what it's like to lose someone to a failure in the system, she said quietly. My daughter, Elena. She was 16. Bacterial meningitis misdiagnosed as flu. By the time they realized what was happening, it was too late. Victoria's hands, folded on the desk, tightened until her knuckles went white. She died 11 years ago. I've spent every year since then trying to find a way to make it mean something, to turn that loss into something that might prevent another parent from standing beside a hospital bed watching their child slip away. The revelation hung between them, heavy and raw. Ethan saw Victoria Cross clearly now, not as the terrifying CEO who everyone feared, but as a mother who had survived the unsurvivable and channeled her grief into something productive, something powerful. The acquisition of MedTech Solutions wasn't a random business decision, Victoria continued. When I saw Sentinel in your research portfolio, when I understood what it could do, I knew this was it. This was how Elena's death could matter. But technology alone isn't enough. It needs someone who understands the human cost, someone who will fight for it the way you fought to keep your project alive at MedTech, someone who won't give up when the obstacles seem insurmountable. She met his eyes. Someone like you, Mr. Cole. Ethan felt the weight of her words settle over him. This wasn't just a job offer. It was a mission, a purpose, a chance to transform his own grief into something that could save lives. For the first time in 11 months, he felt something other than exhaustion and despair. He felt hope. I don't know if I'm strong enough, he admitted. I'm barely holding my life together. Oliver needs so much from me, and I don't know if I can give him what he needs and still do this job justice. You won't be alone, Victoria said. I meant what I said about support staff. We'll provide whatever you need, childcare assistance, flexible scheduling, a team you can delegate to when necessary. Your son comes first, always. But I believe you can do both. I've seen you do it. She gestured at the folder containing his weekend work. You've been doing it all along. You've just been doing it without support. Ethan thought about Oliver, about the school counselor's gentle suggestions that they needed stability, routine, purpose, about the way his son's face lit up on the rare occasions when Ethan came home from work energized rather than defeated, about what it would mean to have the financial security to buy new shoes without panic, to pay rent on time, to stop living in constant fear of the next disaster. And he thought about Sarah, about the hours he'd sat beside her hospital bed, helpless and terrified, while her body betrayed her in ways the doctors didn't understand until it was too late, about the last conversation they'd had when she was still lucid enough to speak, and she'd made him promise to take care of Oliver, to be strong for their son, to build a life worth living. This was how he could keep that promise. When would I start? He asked. Victoria's expression didn't change, but something in her posture relaxed infinitesimally. Immediately. We have a project kickoff meeting next Monday with our hospital partners. I'd like you to present the technical roadmap. Between now and then, you'll meet with the development team, review the current implementation, and familiarize yourself with our deployment strategy. She paused. And this weekend, I suggest you take your son somewhere. Do something together that has nothing to do with work or grief or survival. Take a break. You've earned it. Ethan nodded, overwhelmed. I don't know what to say. Say you'll do justice to the work, Victoria replied. Say you'll honor your wife's memory by ensuring others don't suffer the same fate. Say you'll lead this project with the same determination you've shown in keeping your family together against impossible odds. He stood, extending his hand across the desk. I will. I promise. Victoria shook his hand, her grip firm and steady. Welcome to your new position, Mr. Cole. I look forward to seeing what you'll accomplish. As Ethan turned to leave, his mind spinning with possibilities and responsibilities, and the first genuine excitement he'd felt in almost a year, Victoria's voice stopped him at the door. Mr. Cole? He looked back. Your wife would be proud of you, she said quietly, for how you've cared for your son, for how hard you've fought, for the person you've remained despite everything you've lost. Don't forget that. Ethan's throat constricted. He managed a nod, not trusting himself to speak, and left the office. In the elevator, descending from the 23rd floor, he finally let himself process what had just happened. The fear that had gripped him all morning had transformed into something else entirely. Purpose. Direction. Hope. He pulled out his phone and looked at Oliver's photo again. We're going to be okay, he thought. For the first time in 11 months, we're actually going to be okay. The elevator doors opened on the 7th floor. Ethan stepped out into the familiar hallway, but everything looked different now. Brighter somehow. Full of possibility rather than dread. Martin Chen was walking past, coffee in hand, and did a double take when he saw Ethan. "Hey, Cole, you all right? You were called upstairs and—" "I'm fine," Ethan interrupted, and the smile that spread across his face felt strange, unfamiliar, like a muscle he'd forgotten how to use. "Actually, I'm better than fine. I need to talk to you about transition planning. I'm moving to a new position." Martin's eyebrows shot up. "What? They're promoting you?" "Director of Medical AI Development," Ethan said, the title still surreal on his tongue. "I'll be leading the Sentinel project." "The medical diagnostic system? That's huge, Ethan. Congratulations." Martin looked genuinely pleased, if a bit surprised. "When do you start?" "Monday." "Wow, that's fast. We'll need to redistribute your current accounts, bring someone up to speed on your projects." "I know. I'll help with the transition. But Martin—" Ethan paused, choosing his words carefully. "Thank you for being patient with me. I know I've been difficult to work with lately. I know I've let the team down. I appreciate that you didn't give up on me." Martin's expression softened. "We all go through rough patches, Ethan. I'm glad things are looking up. Your kid deserves to see his dad smile again." The comment hit home. When was the last time Oliver had seen him truly smile? Not the tired, forced expressions he managed at bedtime, but genuine happiness. This weekend, Ethan decided. This weekend he'd take Oliver somewhere special. Maybe the science museum Oliver used to love before everything fell apart. Maybe the park where they used to feed the ducks on Saturday mornings. Somewhere that wasn't haunted by absence and grief. He spent the rest of the day in a strange, focused energy. There was so much to do. Accounts to hand off, documentation to complete, colleagues to brief. But beneath the logistics, there was an undercurrent of excitement that felt almost foreign. He was moving forward. After 11 months of barely surviving, he was actually moving forward. At 4:30 p.m., Ethan's phone buzzed with an email from Victoria Cross's office. Attached was a formal offer letter detailing his new position, salary, benefits, and start date. There was also a brief note. "Mr. Cole, attached, please find the documentation for your new role. My assistant Diane will contact you tomorrow to schedule meetings with the development team and arrange your office space. I've also taken the liberty of contacting 3 highly rated childcare services that specialize in working with grieving families. Their information is attached. All 3 have been vetted and are within walking distance of the office. Helix will cover the first 3 months of fees while you determine which arrangement works best for your family. You're not alone in this anymore." VC Ethan read the note 3 times, each time feeling a lump form in his throat. The practicality of it, the recognition that he needed concrete support, not just platitudes, was somehow more touching than any expression of sympathy could have been. Victoria Cross understood. She'd been where he was. She knew that good intentions meant nothing without tangible help. At 5 p.m. sharp, he shut down his computer and headed for the door. Usually he stayed later, trying to compensate for his morning lateness or his midday absences. But not today. Today he was going to pick up Oliver from after-school care on time. Today he was going to take his son out for pizza and tell him that things were going to get better. The November air was cold when he stepped outside, but it felt refreshing rather than harsh. The city streets were crowded with evening commuters, everyone hurrying toward their own lives, their own families, their own struggles and triumphs. Ethan joined the flow, walking toward the elementary school 6 blocks away. Oliver was waiting in the aftercare room, sitting at a small table and coloring a picture of what appeared to be a spaceship. He looked up when Ethan entered, and his face went through a rapid sequence of emotions. Surprise at seeing his dad early, caution as if expecting bad news, and finally, tentative hope. "Hey, buddy," Ethan said, kneeling down beside the table. "Want to go get pizza?" Oliver studied him carefully. At 7 years old, he'd learned to read his father's moods, to gauge whether the smile was real or just another mask. Did something bad happen? The question broke Ethan's heart, that his son's first assumption was tragedy rather than celebration. But he kept smiling, reaching out to ruffle Oliver's dark hair. "Actually, something good happened, something really good. And I want to celebrate with my favorite person." "What happened?" "I got a new job. Still at the same company, but doing something different. something important, and it means I'll be able to spend more time with you. Better hours, more flexibility. We're going to figure this out, Ollie. I promise. Oliver set down his crayon, his expression serious. Will you still be sad? The directness of the question took Ethan's breath away. Children, he'd learned, had a way of cutting through adult pretense to the truth beneath. Yeah, he admitted. I'll still be sad sometimes. I still miss Mom. You still miss Mom. That's okay. Being sad about people we love is normal. But I'm going to try to be happy too. For you, for me, for all the good things we still have. Oliver considered this, then nodded slowly. Can we get the pizza with the pepperoni that makes smiley faces? Ethan laughed, the sound surprising him with its genuineness. We can get any pizza you want. They walked to the pizza place hand in hand, Oliver chattering about his day at school, the science experiment they'd done with vinegar and baking soda, the chapter book his teacher was reading aloud, the argument he'd had with another boy about which superhero was strongest. Normal, everyday kid things. Things that had seemed impossible to focus on when Ethan was drowning in his own grief. At the restaurant, they sat in a corner booth and ordered the ridiculous smiley face pepperoni pizza. While they waited, Oliver pulled out the colored pencils Ethan always kept in his backpack and started drawing on the paper tablecloth. Ethan watched him, really watched him, and saw things he'd been too exhausted to notice before. The concentration on his son's face as he drew, the way he stuck his tongue out slightly when he was focused, the resilience that allowed him to find joy in simple moments despite carrying his own ocean of grief. Dad? Oliver looked up from his drawing. Yeah? Are you going to cry? Ethan realized there were tears on his cheeks, but they weren't the hopeless tears he'd become so accustomed to. These were different, cleaner somehow. Happy tears, he said. Is that weird? Kinda, Oliver admitted, but it's okay. Ms. Ramirez says all feelings are okay as long as we talk about them. Ms. Ramirez was the school counselor. Apparently some of her wisdom was sticking. Ms. Ramirez is smart, Ethan said. I'm crying because I'm happy that we get to have pizza together. And I'm happy that things are going to get easier for us. And I'm happy that I have such an amazing kid. Oliver wrinkled his nose, embarrassed but pleased. You're being weird, Dad. Yeah, well, dads are allowed to be weird sometimes. The pizza arrived and they ate together, sauce on their fingers and grease on their chins, talking about nothing and everything. For the first time in nearly a year, Ethan didn't feel the crushing weight of all the things he was doing wrong. He felt present. He felt like maybe, just maybe, he could actually be the father Oliver needed. That night, after the bedtime routine, teeth brushed, pajamas on, story read, Oliver looked up at Ethan from his pillow and asked the question he asked every single night. Do you think Mom can see us? Usually, Ethan deflected or gave a vague answer about hoping so. But tonight, fortified by the day's unexpected gifts, he tried something different. I think Mom would want us to be happy, he said carefully. I think she'd want us to remember her, but also to keep living, to find good things, to take care of each other. He smoothed Oliver's hair back from his forehead. And I think if she could see us, she'd be proud of how brave you've been, how strong, how you keep going even when things are hard. Are you going to keep going too? Oliver asked. Yeah, buddy, I am. We both are. Together. Oliver nodded, satisfied, and closed his eyes. Within minutes, his breathing had deepened into sleep. Ethan sat there for a long time, watching his son's peaceful face, feeling the full weight of responsibility and love and possibility. Victoria Cross had given him more than a job today. She'd given him a lifeline, a chance to transform his grief into purpose, his failure into success, his isolation into connection. As he finally stood to leave Oliver's room, Ethan made a silent promise. To Sarah, to Oliver, to himself, to the thousands of people Sentinel might someday save. He would not waste this opportunity. He would not let fear or exhaustion or self-doubt derail him. He would do the work. He would lead the project. He would prove that Victoria's faith in him was justified. And maybe, just maybe, he would discover that a life shattered by loss could be rebuilt into something strong enough to bear the weight of hope. The week ahead would be intense. Meetings, presentations, learning new systems, proving himself to a team that didn't know him yet. But for the first time since Sarah's death, Ethan felt ready. Not because the grief had lessened, but because he'd finally found a reason to carry it forward instead of letting it crush him. He returned to the living room, opened his laptop, and began reviewing the technical documentation Victoria had sent. The Sentinel system was more sophisticated than his original design, refined by Helix's resources and expertise. But at its core, it was still his vision, his algorithm, his dream of a world where preventable deaths could be prevented. Hours passed. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of his laptop and the occasional sound of traffic from the street below. Ethan worked with a focus he hadn't felt in months, diving deep into code, analyzing data models, understanding the infrastructure that had been built around his original research. At some point, he noticed an email notification. Another message from Victoria Cross, sent at 11:47 p.m. Mr. Cole, I saw you logged into the Sentinel development server. I should not be surprised that you're already working. Go to bed. You'll need your energy for Monday. The first presentation is always the hardest. And thank you for accepting the position. Elena would have liked knowing her story helped someone else's family find their way forward. VC. Ethan closed his laptop, the words resonating in the quiet apartment. Two people connected by loss, choosing to build something meaningful from the wreckage. It wasn't redemption. Nothing could bring back Sarah or Elena. But it was purpose. It was forward momentum. It was choosing life over merely surviving. He stood, stretched, and walked to the window. The city stretched out below, millions of lives intersecting, each person carrying their own griefs and hopes and struggles. Tomorrow, he would wake up and continue the difficult work of being a single father. Monday, he would step into a role that terrified and excited him in equal measure. But tonight, for the first time in 11 months, Ethan Cole allowed himself to believe that he might actually make it through. Not unscathed. The scars were permanent, but intact, functioning. Maybe even happy, in the careful, reconstructed way that people learn happiness after devastation. He checked on Oliver one more time before heading to bed. His son slept peacefully, one arm wrapped around the rabbit that had been with him that night at the office, when Victoria had seen them and set this entire transformation in motion. As Ethan finally settled into his own bed, exhausted but strangely content, his last thought before sleep claimed him was this. Sometimes the worst moments of our lives are actually doorways. We just can't see it until someone on the other side reaches through and pulls us towards something better. Victoria Cross had reached through. Now it was time for Ethan to walk forward. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that made everything feel sharper, more real. Ethan stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie for the third time. The face looking back at him was the same one that had stared hollow-eyed at this reflection for 11 months, but something had shifted. The dark circles were still there. The lines of grief etched around his eyes hadn't disappeared, but there was something else now. Focus. Purpose. "Dad, you look fancy," Oliver said from the doorway, his backpack already strapped on, ready for school. Ethan turned, managed a smile that felt almost natural. "Big day at work. I want to make a good impression." "Are you nervous?" The question was so perceptive it made Ethan pause. "Yeah, buddy, I am. But the good kind of nervous. The kind that means something important is about to happen." Oliver nodded seriously, as if filing this information away for future reference. "Mom used to say being nervous meant you cared about doing something right." The mention of Sarah no longer felt like a knife to the chest. It still hurt, would always hurt, but Ethan found he could breathe through it now. She was right. She usually was. They walked to school together, Oliver chattering about a science project involving plants and sunlight. Ethan listened, really listened, committing the details to memory so he could ask about it later. These small moments of connection, they mattered. They were the foundation everything else was built on. At the school gate, Oliver hesitated before running off to join his friends. "Dad, good luck today." "Thanks, Ollie. Have a good day. I'll pick you up on time, I promise." "I know," Oliver said, and the simple confidence in those two words carried more weight than any professional accolade ever could. Ethan arrived at Helix Innovations at 8:15 a.m., earlier than he'd managed in months. The building looked different in morning light, less imposing somehow, or maybe he was just seeing it through different eyes. He badged through security, nodded at familiar faces, and took the elevator up to the medical technology division on the 14th floor, a section of the building he'd never had reason to visit before. The doors opened onto a workspace that buzzed with focused energy. Unlike the corporate sterility of the lower floors, this area had the feel of a research lab, whiteboards covered in diagrams and equations, clusters of monitors displaying complex data visualizations, a coffee station that looked well used and chaotic. People moved between workstations with purpose, their conversations peppered with technical jargon that Ethan recognized from his MedTech Solutions days. "Mr. Cole?" A woman in her early 30s approached, extending her hand. She had bright red hair pulled into a practical ponytail and wore jeans with a Helix polo shirt. "I'm Dr. Priya Sharma, lead biomedical engineer on the Sentinel project. Welcome to the team." Her handshake was firm, her smile genuine but assessing. Ethan recognized the look. She was measuring him, trying to determine if he was worthy of leading her project. "Please call me Ethan, and thank you. I'm looking forward to getting up to speed." "Ms. Cross said you designed the original algorithm," Priya said, gesturing for him to follow her through the workspace. "I've been working with it for over a year now, and I have to say the foundational architecture is brilliant. The pattern recognition matrices, the way you weighted different vital sign combinations, it's elegant." The compliment caught Ethan off guard. He'd spent so long feeling like a failure that praise felt foreign. "Thank you, though I suspect your team has improved it considerably since then." "We've refined it," Priya admitted, leading him to a glass-walled conference room where several people were already gathered. "But refinement only works when the foundation is solid. You gave us that foundation." The conference room filled quickly. Ethan found himself surrounded by people who had been living and breathing Sentinel while he'd been struggling just to survive. Marcus Chen, the data architect who'd built the hospital integration systems, Dr. James Riley, the clinical consultant who'd designed the pilot program at Mercy General, Sarah Kim, the coincidence of the name hit Ethan hard, who managed regulatory compliance, and 3 other engineers whose names Ethan tried desperately to commit to memory. They were all younger than him, he realized, most in their late 20s or early 30s, brilliant and energetic, and deeply invested in the work. And now he was supposed to lead them. "Good morning, everyone." Victoria Cross's voice cut through the ambient conversation as she entered the room. She wore another perfectly tailored suit, this one charcoal gray, and carried herself with the same commanding presence Ethan had witnessed in her office. "Thank you for being here. I know most of you are already familiar with the work ahead, but today marks an important transition. I'd like to introduce Ethan Cole, who will be taking over as Director of Medical AI Development." The room's attention shifted to him, and Ethan felt the weight of their scrutiny. These people had been working without him for 18 months. They'd built something extraordinary. Why would they need him now? As if reading his thoughts, Victoria continued, "Mr. Cole is the original architect of the Sentinel system. His vision and technical expertise are exactly what this project needs as we move from pilot program to full-scale deployment. He brings not only deep knowledge of the algorithm, but also the kind of personal commitment that ensures we never lose sight of why this work matters." She looked directly at Ethan. "Would you like to say a few words?" Ethan stood, his throat suddenly dry. He'd prepared remarks the night before, professional and polished. But looking at these faces, these people who had been fighting the same fight he'd abandoned when life fell apart, the prepared words felt hollow. "I'm not going to pretend I have all the answers," he said quietly. "Most of you have been working on Sentinel longer than I have at this point. You've taken an idea I had to shelve and turned it into something real, something that's already saving lives. That's extraordinary, and I have immense respect for what you've accomplished." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "What I can offer is perspective on why this system exists. I designed Sentinel because I believe the gap between diagnosis and intervention was killing people unnecessarily. I believe technology could bridge that gap. And then I watched my wife die from the exact kind of infection Sentinel was designed to catch." The room went very still. Priya's eyes widened slightly. Marcus leaned forward in his chair. "So yes, this is personal for me," Ethan continued. "Every patient Sentinel flags, every early intervention we enable, every life we save, that's personal. and I promise you that I will fight for this project with everything I have. I will protect it, advocate for it, and ensure it reaches its full potential. Not because it's my job, but because I understand the cost of failure in a way I wish I didn't." The silence stretched for a moment, then Victoria spoke. "Thank you, Ethan. That brings us to today's primary objective. At 2 o'clock this afternoon, we have a presentation to the Hospital Network Consortium, 17 systems representing over 200 facilities across 8 states. They need to see the technical roadmap for Sentinel's deployment, understand the implementation timeline, and be convinced that this project is worth the significant investment they're being asked to make." She turned to Ethan. "I'd like you to deliver that presentation." Ethan felt his stomach drop. "This afternoon? You have 5 hours to prepare. The team will bring you up to speed on what's been developed since you left MedTech Solutions. Priya will walk you through the current system architecture. Marcus can explain the integration challenges. Dr. Riley will brief you on clinical outcomes from the pilot program." Victoria's expression was impassive, but Ethan detected something beneath it. A test, perhaps, or maybe just confidence that he could rise to the challenge. "This is your project now, Mr. Cole. Time to show everyone why." She left the room, and Ethan found himself facing a team that looked both sympathetic and curious. Priya broke the silence first. "Okay then, let's get you ready to dazzle some hospital administrators. Conference rooms hours for the next 4 hours. Who wants to order lunch?" What followed was one of the most intense crash courses Ethan had ever experienced. Priya pulled up system diagrams on the massive display screen, walking him through how the algorithm had evolved. The core pattern recognition he'd designed remained intact, but the team had added layers of machine learning that allowed Sentinel to adapt to individual hospital environments, accounting for local variations in patient demographics, common pathogens, and even seasonal patterns. "We're not just flagging potential sepsis anymore," Priya explained, her enthusiasm evident in the rapid-fire way she spoke. "The system learns from every case it monitors. If a particular hospital sees a spike in antibiotic-resistant infections, Sentinel adjusts its sensitivity parameters. If a facility has a population of elderly patients with chronic conditions, it recalibrates baseline expectations. The algorithm you created was brilliant, but now it's brilliant and adaptive." Marcus took over, showing Ethan how they'd solved the integration nightmare of connecting Sentinel to 17 different hospital network systems, each with its own electronic health record platform, data architecture, and security requirements. "The challenge wasn't technical sophistication," Marcus said, pulling up a flowchart that looked like organized chaos. "It was bureaucratic inertia. Every hospital has IT departments that are rightfully paranoid about system security and data privacy. We had to build integration protocols that could work with legacy systems while meeting current HIPAA standards and satisfying every hospital's individual security requirements. It took 9 months just to get the pilot program approved at Mercy General." Dr. Riley, a thoughtful man in his 50s with the calm demeanor of someone who'd spent decades in emergency medicine, provided the clinical context. "The pilot results exceeded our most optimistic projections. We flagged 37 potential sepsis cases. In 29 of those, early intervention occurred based on Sentinel's alert. All 29 survived. But here's what's really remarkable. In 8 cases, Sentinel identified patterns that weren't sepsis at all, but other critical conditions that might have been missed: cardiac events, pulmonary embolisms, acute kidney failure. The system is identifying systemic distress before it manifests in obvious symptoms." "Wait," Ethan interrupted, his mind racing. "If it's catching non-sepsis conditions, that means the algorithm is recognizing underlying patterns of physiological instability, not just infection markers." "Exactly," Riley said, clearly pleased. "Your original design focused on sepsis because that was the target, but the fundamental approach, analyzing multiple data streams for subtle pattern shifts that indicate system-wide distress, that's applicable to any critical condition that follows a detectable progression." The implications hit Ethan like a revelation. Sentinel wasn't just a sepsis detection system. It was a platform for early warning of any critical medical event that left digital breadcrumbs in patient data. The scope of what they could accomplish suddenly seemed vast. "How are the hospital administrators responding to the expanded capabilities?" he asked. Sarah Kim, the regulatory specialist, grimaced slightly. "Mixed. Some see the potential and are excited, Others are nervous about liability. If Sentinel flags something and the medical staff misses or dismisses the alert, who's responsible? We've had to develop very careful protocols about how alerts are presented, who receives them, and what the decision tree looks like for follow-up. The presentation this afternoon, Ethan said, understanding dawning. It's not just about showing them what Sentinel can do. It's about convincing them that the benefits outweigh the risks. Now you're getting it, Priya said with a slight smile. These aren't tech people. They're administrators, risk managers, and medical directors who have to answer to boards and patients and insurance companies. They need to see that this system will make their hospitals better, safer, and ideally more efficient. And they need to trust that we're not going to make their lives more complicated. Ethan spent the next 2 hours diving into data, reviewing case studies from the pilot program, and understanding the financial models that justified the implementation costs. The numbers were staggering. Each hospital would need to invest significant resources in integration, training, and ongoing support. But the potential savings from reduced mortality, shorter hospital stays, and fewer complications were equally impressive. By noon, his head was spinning with information. The team ordered sandwiches, and they ate while going through the draft presentation that Priya's team had prepared. It was comprehensive, technically sound, and completely bloodless. Charts and graphs and projections that would put half the audience to sleep. This won't work, Ethan said, scrolling through the slides. The room went quiet. Priya looked up from her sandwich, defensive. What do you mean? We've got all the data they need to make an informed decision. You have data, Ethan agreed, but you don't have a story. These are people who make life and death decisions every day. They don't need another PowerPoint deck full of statistics. They need to understand why this matters. The statistics show why it matters, Marcus objected. 29 lives saved in 6 months. That's a powerful number. It's not powerful, it's abstract, Ethan countered, surprised by his own certainty. 29 is just a number until you make it real, until you show them that each of those numbers is someone's wife, someone's father, someone's child, until you make them feel the weight of what we're trying to prevent. Dr. Riley leaned back in his chair, studying Ethan with new interest. What are you suggesting? Ethan thought about Sarah, about the moment in the hospital when the attending physician had finally understood what was happening, but it was already too late. About the look on the doctor's face, that mixture of professional composure and deep personal failure. That doctor had cared, had tried, but the information had come too late. I'm suggesting we start with a case study, Ethan said slowly, the presentation taking shape in his mind. One specific patient from the pilot program. We walk them through the timeline, symptoms, vital signs, lab results. We show them exactly when Sentinel flagged the case and exactly what would have happened without that early warning. We make it concrete, real, and then we multiply that one case by the thousands of patients in their networks and ask them a simple question. How many lives is this worth? The room was silent for a long moment. Then Priya pulled her laptop closer. Case number 14. 62-year-old male, post-surgical infection. Sentinel flagged him 19 hours before he would have developed septic shock. Without intervention, projected mortality was over 70%. With early treatment, he walked out of the hospital 6 days later and is currently at home with his family. Perfect, Ethan said. Let's build the presentation around him. They had 90 minutes before the meeting. The team worked with focused intensity, rebuilding the presentation from the ground up. Ethan wrote the narrative framework while Priya pulled the medical data. Marcus created visualizations that showed the progression of the patient's condition with and without Sentinel's intervention. Dr. Riley provided the clinical commentary that would resonate with medical directors. At 1:45 p.m., Ethan stood in the main conference room on the 23rd floor, watching hospital administrators file in. They were an older crowd, mostly in their 50s and 60s, wearing business attire that suggested they were far removed from the emergency rooms and I see us, their decisions affected. They took their seats around the massive conference table, some checking phones, others engaged in quiet conversations. They had the look of people attending yet another required meeting. Victoria sat at the head of the table, composed and professional. She caught Ethan's eye, gave the slightest nod of encouragement. The room settled. Victoria made brief introductions, explaining that Ethan would be presenting the technical roadmap for Sentinel's expanded deployment. Then she turned the floor over to him. Ethan pulled up the first slide. Not a chart or a graph, but a photograph. A middle-aged man with gray hair and a warm smile, standing with his family at what looked like a backyard barbecue. "This is Robert Chen," Ethan began. 62 years old, retired teacher, grandfather of 4. 6 months ago, Robert underwent routine surgery to repair a hernia. The surgery was successful. Recovery was expected to be straightforward, and for the first 36 hours, it appeared to be exactly that. He clicked to the next slide, showing Robert's vital signs chart from the hospital monitoring system. To an untrained eye, the numbers looked relatively normal. "This is Robert's data from hour 40 of his post-operative recovery. Heart rate slightly elevated but within acceptable parameters. Blood pressure normal. Temperature 99.2, barely a fever." His attending nurse noted he seemed a bit tired, but attributed it to the surgery and pain medication. No cause for alarm. Another click. The chart now showed additional data streams, lab results, medication logs, subtle changes in respiratory rate. This is the same moment, but with additional data layers that Sentinel monitors continuously. Notice the pattern here. Ethan used a laser pointer to highlight specific correlations. Heart rate elevation coinciding with a slight increase in respiratory rate. White blood cell count trending upward over the past 12 hours. A microscopic shift in blood pressure that wouldn't trigger standard alerts, but indicates developing systemic stress. Individually, none of these things are concerning. Together, they form a pattern. He looked around the room. Every administrator was paying attention now. At hour 41, Sentinel flagged Robert Chen as a potential sepsis case. The alert went to the charge nurse, who consulted with the attending physician. They ordered immediate blood cultures and started broad-spectrum antibiotics as a precautionary measure. Click. The chart now showed 2 projected timelines, branching from that moment. This is what happened with Sentinel's early intervention. Robert's infection was caught before it could progress to sepsis. He spent 3 additional days in the hospital for monitoring and completed his antibiotic course at home. He made a full recovery. Ethan paused, letting that sink in, then highlighted the other timeline. This is the projection without early intervention. Based on the infection type and Robert's age and health status, if the sepsis had been allowed to develop unchecked, he would have entered septic shock approximately 19 hours after Sentinel's initial flag. At that point, even with aggressive treatment, his survival probability would have been around 28%. The room was absolutely silent now. Ethan pulled up a new image, a photo of children playing in a sprinkler, laughing and carefree. These are Robert's grandchildren. They don't know how close they came to losing him. His family doesn't spend their days thinking about the infection that almost killed him, because it didn't kill him. They're too busy living their lives. And that's exactly the point. He closed the image and brought up the broader data from the pilot program. In 6 months at Mercy General Hospital, Sentinel flagged 37 cases similar to Robert's, 37 patients whose vital signs showed subtle but detectable patterns indicating developing critical conditions. In 29 of those cases, early intervention occurred. All 29 survived. In the control group, patients with similar conditions but without Sentinel monitoring, the survival rate was 63%. Ethan let the mathematics speak for themselves for a moment, then continued. You represent 17 hospital networks, 206 facilities, approximately 42,000 staffed beds. Based on national statistics, roughly 8% of hospitalized patients will develop infections serious enough to risk sepsis. That's over 3,000 cases per year across your networks. Currently, about 30% of those patients will die despite treatment. We're talking about 900 preventable deaths annually. The number hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Sentinel can't save everyone, Ethan admitted. Some infections are too aggressive, some patients too compromised. But our pilot data suggests we can improve early detection rates by 70 to 80%. If we apply that to your networks, we're potentially saving 600 lives per year. 600 Robert Chens who get to go home to their families. He moved to the technical section of the presentation, walking them through the integration protocols, the security measures, the training requirements. But he kept bringing it back to the human element, to the concrete reality of what they were trying to accomplish. When he reached the financial analysis, he didn't shy away from the costs. Implementation across your networks will require significant investment: hardware upgrades, software integration, staff training, ongoing support. We're estimating approximately $18 million in first-year costs distributed across all facilities. He saw several administrators shift uncomfortably. That was a massive number. But consider this, Ethan continued. The average cost of treating a patient with severe sepsis is approximately $60,000. The average hospital stay is 18 days. Complications and readmissions add another 30% to that cost. If Sentinel enables earlier intervention, we're not just saving lives, we're reducing hospital stays, minimizing complications, and decreasing readmission rates. Based on our pilot data, the system pays for itself within 3 years through improved patient outcomes and reduced treatment costs. He showed them the detailed financial models, the projected ROI, the risk assessment that Sarah Kim's team had prepared. But the numbers, Ethan had learned, were never really about the money. They were about giving people permission to make the decision they already wanted to make. I know you're being asked to take a risk, Ethan said, closing the presentation and returning to Robert Chen's smiling photograph. You're being asked to trust a new technology, to invest resources in an untested system at scale, to change protocols and workflows that your staff are comfortable with. That's a lot to ask, but I'm going to ask anyway, because the alternative is continuing to accept preventable deaths as inevitable. And I don't believe any of you are comfortable with that alternative. He looked around the table, meeting eyes, seeing the thoughtful expressions, the internal calculations. My wife died from sepsis 11 months ago. She was 34 years old. The infection that killed her showed the same subtle warning signs that Sentinel is designed to detect. If the system had existed in her hospital, if someone had been watching the patterns in her data the way we're now able to, she might still be alive. I can't change what happened to her, but we can change what happens to the next patient and the one after that, and the thousands who will come through your hospitals in the years ahead. Ethan's voice had dropped to something quieter, more personal. Sentinel isn't perfect. Technology alone isn't the answer, but it's a tool that can help your medical staff do what they already want to do, save lives, and I'm asking you to give them that tool. He sat down. The silence in the room felt different now, charged with something Ethan couldn't quite name. Victoria stood smoothly, taking control of the meeting. Thank you, Mr. Cole. I think that gives everyone a clear understanding of what we're proposing. Are there questions? The questions came rapidly after that. Technical concerns about integration with specific hospital systems, practical questions about staff training and alert fatigue, financial questions about implementation timelines and payment structures. Ethan fielded them with help from the team, Priya and Marcus jumping in on technical details, Dr. Riley addressing clinical concerns. An hour later, the meeting concluded with a commitment from the consortium to review the proposal and provide decisions within 2 weeks. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. It was progress. As the administrators filed out, several stopped to shake Ethan's hand, to comment on the presentation, to share their own stories of patients lost to sepsis. One woman, the chief medical officer of a large urban hospital system, held his hand a moment longer than necessary. My brother, she said quietly, 3 years ago. Post-operative infection, just like your Robert Chen, but we didn't catch it in time. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. I'll be recommending approval to my board. When the room finally emptied, Ethan found himself alone with Victoria. She stood by the windows, looking out at the city, her posture as perfect as always, but something subtly different in the set of her shoulders. That was well done, she said without turning around. Better than well done. That was exactly what they needed to hear. Ethan joined her at the window, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried him through the presentation was draining away, leaving him hollow. Think they'll approve it? Yes, Victoria said with quiet certainty. Not all of them, not immediately, but enough. You gave them a reason to believe, and more importantly, you gave them permission to care. That's harder to do than you might think in environments where everything is risk management and liability assessment. They stood in silence for a moment, two people connected by parallel griefs, watching the city move through its afternoon routine far below. My daughter loved hospitals, Victoria said unexpectedly. Strange thing to say, I know, but she wanted to be a doctor. She volunteered at the free clinic near our house, helping with administrative work, watching the nurses, asking endless questions. She believed medicine was about helping people, not just treating diseases. She would have loved Sentinel. It was the most personal thing Victoria had ever said to him. Ethan didn't know how to respond, so he just listened. After she died, I couldn't go near hospitals for 2 years, Victoria continued. The smell of antiseptic made me physically ill. The sound of monitors beeping sent me into panic attacks. But eventually I realized that avoiding the place she died meant avoiding the places she loved. So I started volunteering at the same clinic she had. I sat at the same desk she'd sat at. And slowly, I transformed my fear into something useful. She finally turned to look at him, and Ethan saw something in her face he'd never expected to see from the ice-cold CEO everyone feared. Vulnerability. You did that today, she said. You transformed your grief into something useful. You took the worst thing that ever happened to you and turned it into a reason for all those administrators to say yes to saving lives. That's not a small thing, Ethan. That's the hardest thing there is. His throat felt tight. I just told them the truth. Exactly, Victoria said. And the truth, when it's offered with that kind of honesty and purpose, is irresistible. You didn't manipulate them. You invited them to be part of something meaningful. That's leadership. Ethan thought about Oliver, waiting at school for pickup, about the apartment with its overdue bills and constant stress, about the fragile, reconstructed life he was trying to build. I'm still terrified I'm going to fail, he admitted. The presentation went well, but actually leading this project, managing a team, delivering results, that's different. What if I can't do it? Victoria's expression shifted back to something more businesslike, but the warmth didn't entirely leave her eyes. Then you'll learn, you'll adapt, you'll ask for help when you need it, and you'll persist when things get difficult. That's all anyone can do. She checked her watch. It's almost 3:30. Don't you have a child to pick up from school? The reminder jolted him. Yes, I do. Thank you for everything, for this opportunity, for believing I could do this. I didn't give you an opportunity out of charity, Mr. Cole, Victoria said, her tone crisp again. I gave you responsibility because you earned it. Now go be a father. We'll reconvene tomorrow to discuss next steps. Ethan grabbed his jacket and headed for the elevator, his mind still processing everything that had happened. The presentation had gone better than he dared hope. The administrators had listened, really listened. For the first time since Sarah's death, he'd done something that felt genuinely important. The school pickup line was crowded when he arrived, parents clustered in groups, chatting while they waited. Ethan had never been part of those groups, had always felt like an outsider among the put-together mothers and casually confident fathers who seemed to navigate parenting with ease. Today, he still felt separate, but it bothered him less somehow. Oliver emerged from the school building with his usual cautious scan of the waiting area, his face lighting up when he spotted Ethan's car exactly where it was supposed to be. You're on time, Oliver said as he climbed into the back seat, surprise evident in his voice. The comment stung a little, a reminder of how many times Ethan had been late, how unreliable he'd become. But it was also an opportunity. I'll be on time more often now, Ethan said. The new job has better hours. Better everything, really. How was your day? As they drove home, Oliver talked about his science project and a disagreement with a friend and the chapter book they were reading in class. Normal, ordinary kid things. Ethan listened, asked questions, and felt something settle in his chest, a quiet contentment he hadn't known he was capable of anymore. At home, they made dinner together. Well, Ethan made dinner while Oliver sat at the kitchen table doing homework and providing commentary. Spaghetti with meat sauce, garlic bread, salad that Oliver would probably ignore, but Ethan insisted on anyway. The kitchen smelled like home, like normal family life, like possibility. After dinner, after homework was checked and the bedtime routine completed, Ethan found himself back at his laptop reviewing the notes from today's meeting. The consortium would need follow-up materials. There would be questions, concerns, details to iron out, But for the first time in months, the work felt like more than just survival. It felt like building something that mattered. His phone buzzed with a text message. Victoria Cross. Heard from 3 administrators already. All positive. Well done today. Take tomorrow morning for yourself. Team meeting at 1 p.m. Ethan stared at the message, surprised by the gesture. Victoria Cross, who ran Helix Innovations with ruthless efficiency, was telling him to take a morning off. He typed a reply. Thank you. I appreciate the flexibility. Her response came quickly. You have a son who needs you. Never apologize for that. The work will wait. Ethan set down his phone, feeling something warm expand in his chest. For 11 months, he'd been drowning in guilt. Guilt for not being present enough for Oliver. Guilt for not performing well enough at work. Guilt for surviving when Sarah hadn't. But maybe, just maybe, he could stop drowning. Maybe he could learn to float. And eventually, to swim. The week that followed was intense but manageable. The team welcomed him more warmly than he'd expected, perhaps won over by his presentation to the consortium, or perhaps just responding to his genuine investment in the work. Priya walked him through every line of code in the current system, patiently explaining the changes her team had made. Marcus involved him in discussions about scaling the integration protocols to handle 200 hospitals instead of 1. Doctor. Riley invited him to observe a demonstration at Mercy General, where Ethan watched Sentinel in action, the quiet alert on a nurse's tablet, the calm consultation with the attending physician, the smooth escalation that potentially saved a young mother's life. At home, things were also shifting. With the childcare assistance Victoria had arranged, Oliver was attending an after-school program specifically designed for grieving children. He came home talking about art therapy and group discussions with other kids who understood what it felt like to lose a parent. The shadows under his eyes were lightening. His smiles came more easily. Ethan established a new routine. Mornings with Oliver, getting him ready for school and walking him to the building. Workdays that felt productive rather than desperate. Evenings at home, present and focused on his son. And yes, sometimes late nights working after Oliver was asleep, but by choice now rather than frantic necessity. 2 weeks after the presentation, the responses from the hospital consortium began arriving. 13 of the 17 networks approved participation in the Sentinel expansion. 2 requested additional information and wanted to revisit the decision in 3 months. 2 declined, citing budget concerns and existing commitments to other technology initiatives. 13 networks. Over 150 hospitals, thousands of patients who would benefit from early detection. It was better than Ethan had dared hope. The team celebrated with pizza in the conference room, their enthusiasm infectious. Priya raised a soda can in a toast. To Sentinel, and to our fearless leader who convinced a bunch of risk-averse administrators to take a chance on us. Everyone cheered, and Ethan felt his face flush with embarrassed pleasure. This was his team now, these brilliant, dedicated people who had spent 18 months building something extraordinary were trusting him to lead them forward. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Victoria appeared in the doorway mid-celebration, and the room quieted slightly, the automatic response to the CEO's presence. But she was smiling, a rare sight that made her seem almost human. I wanted to congratulate the team personally, she said, accepting a slice of pizza someone offered her with surprising grace. 13 Networks represents the largest coordinated healthcare technology deployment Helix has ever attempted. You should all be proud. She looked at Ethan. Mr. Cole, a word when you have a moment? They stepped into her office down the hall. Through the windows, the November sunset painted the city in shades of gold and amber. The real work begins now, Victoria said, settling into her chair behind the massive desk. Implementation timelines, training protocols, integration testing. It's going to be intense. I know, Ethan said. The team is ready. We've already started mapping out the deployment schedule. I'm sure you have, but I didn't call you in here to discuss logistics. Victoria pulled out a folder. She always seemed to have folders, Ethan had noticed, and slid it across the desk. This is an executive summary of a conversation I had with the board this morning. Helix is establishing a formal medical technology division as a permanent part of our corporate structure. Sentinel is just the beginning. We're looking at other areas where AI and advanced data analytics can improve patient outcomes. Ethan opened the folder, scanning the document. The scope was ambitious: early detection systems for cardiac events, stroke prediction algorithms, medication interaction monitoring, a whole suite of tools designed to catch problems before they became crises. "This is incredible," he said, "but it's also massive. The resources required are substantial," Victoria agreed, "which is why we're creating a dedicated leadership structure. I'll be stepping away from my role as CEO of Helix Innovations at the end of the fiscal year." Ethan's head snapped up. "What?" "I've been CEO for 12 years," Victoria said calmly. "I've built this company into something successful and stable, but I've also sacrificed most of my personal life to do it. My daughter died 11 years ago, and I've spent the decade since then using work to avoid dealing with that loss. It's time to stop running." She gestured at the folder. "The board is creating a new position, Chief Innovation Officer for Medical Technology, someone who can focus entirely on developing and scaling these life-saving systems without the distraction of running the entire company. I'm taking that role." Ethan was too stunned to respond immediately. Victoria Cross, the woman everyone feared, was voluntarily stepping down from power? "You look shocked," Victoria observed with a slight smile. "I am shocked. You're one of the most successful CEOs in the industry. Why would you give that up?" "Because success isn't the same thing as fulfillment," Victoria said quietly. "I've achieved everything I set out to accomplish in business, but I've spent 11 years emotionally frozen, using corporate objectives as a shield against grief and connection. Watching you these past few weeks, seeing you balance fatherhood and work, seeing you transform your loss into purpose without losing your humanity in the process, it reminded me that there's more to life than quarterly earnings and shareholder value." She stood, moving to the window as she so often did. "I want to do what my daughter would have wanted me to do." She believed medicine was about helping people. "So I'm going to help people. Not by managing administrative structures and budget allocations, but by ensuring that systems like Sentinel get developed and deployed as widely as possible." Ethan joined her at the window, the two of them silhouetted against the fading light. "Your daughter would be proud of you," he said, echoing the words Victoria had once said to him. "Perhaps," Victoria allowed, "but more importantly, I'll finally be proud of myself for choosing connection over isolation, for allowing myself to care about something beyond professional achievement." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Victoria turned to him with a more business-like expression. "There's one more thing. The Medical Technology Division will need a strong executive team. I'll be Chief Innovation Officer focusing on strategy and partnerships, but we'll need a Vice President of AI Development to oversee the technical side, someone who understands both the technology and the mission." She raised an eyebrow. "Interested?" Ethan's mind raced. Vice President. It was a bigger role than he'd ever imagined for himself. More responsibility, more pressure, more everything, but also more opportunity to make a difference. More resources to devote to projects like Sentinel, more power to ensure these systems reach the people who needed them. "Yes," he said, "I'm interested." Victoria extended her hand. "Then welcome to the executive team, Mr. Cole. We'll make the announcement after the new year. Until then, let's focus on getting Sentinel deployed successfully." As Ethan left her office that evening, his head was spinning with the enormity of what had just happened. In 2 weeks, he'd gone from a struggling single father on the verge of being fired to director of medical AI development to soon-to-be vice president. It felt surreal, impossible, like someone else's life. But it was his life. He'd earned it through persistence and honesty and the willingness to transform his pain into purpose. Oliver was waiting at the after-school program, working on a painted handprint project. When he saw Ethan, he held up his artwork proudly, a tree with colorful handprints forming the leaves. "It's a family tree," Oliver explained. "We put our handprints for people we love. The red one is me, the blue one is you, and the purple one is Mom." Ethan felt his throat tighten. The grief counselor had said this was healthy, finding ways to keep Sarah's memory present without letting it become overwhelming. The tree was beautiful, a visual representation of their broken but enduring family. "It's perfect, buddy," Ethan said, meaning it. "Let's hang it up at home." They walked to the car together, Oliver chattering about the paint colors and which friends had made which trees. Ethan listened with only half his attention, the other half still processing the conversation with Victoria. "Dad?" Oliver's voice interrupted his thoughts. "You seem happy." The observation was startling. "I am happy. Is that weird?" Oliver considered this seriously. "A little. You've been sad for a long time." "I've been sad," Ethan agreed. "I'm still sad sometimes. I still miss Mom every single day. But I'm learning that you can be sad about something you lost and still be happy about things you have. Does that make sense?" "I think so," Oliver said slowly. "Like how I'm sad Mom's not here, but happy you picked me up on time?" Ethan laughed, the sound surprising him. Exactly like that. At home, they hung the family tree on the refrigerator with magnets. Ethan made dinner while Oliver did homework, and the evening unfolded with comfortable domesticity. Bath time, story time, the usual negotiations about 5 more minutes of reading before lights out. After Oliver finally fell asleep, Ethan returned to the kitchen and stood looking at the family tree. 3 handprints, red, blue, purple. Incomplete but honest. A visual reminder that families could survive loss and still remain families. His phone buzzed with an email from Priya containing deployment schedules for the first wave of hospital implementations. Work was calling, as it always would, but for the first time in 11 months, Ethan felt capable of answering that call without sacrificing everything else. He made himself a cup of tea and settled at the kitchen table with his laptop, ready to dive into the logistics of changing healthcare for thousands of patients across 8 states. The work was important, the mission was clear, and somewhere in the midst of technical specifications and implementation timelines, Ethan realized he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Not because everything was perfect, it wasn't, and probably never would be, but because he'd found a way to carry his grief forward without being crushed by it. Because he'd discovered that purpose and pain could coexist. Because he'd learned, finally, that surviving wasn't the same as living, and he was ready to do both. The purple handprint on the refrigerator caught his eye again. Sarah would have loved this, he thought. The project, the purpose, the slow rebuilding of a life that honored her memory without being imprisoned by it. "We're doing okay," he whispered to the quiet kitchen. "Oliver and me. We're going to be okay." And for the first time, he truly believed it. The first hospital implementation began 3 weeks before Christmas. St. Catherine's Medical Center in Philadelphia, a sprawling facility with over 400 beds, had volunteered to be the pilot site for the expanded rollout. Ethan stood in their IT operations center at 6 in the morning, watching his team run final integration tests while doctors and nurses gathered for the training session that would begin in an hour. "All systems green," Marcus reported, his eyes scanning multiple monitors displaying data streams from various hospital departments. "We're live in ICU, emergency, and post-surgical recovery. The algorithm is processing baseline data now, establishing normal parameters for each unit." Ethan felt the familiar flutter of nerves mixed with anticipation. This was it. The moment when Sentinel stopped being a successful pilot program and became real healthcare infrastructure. Every patient admitted to St. Catherine's would now be monitored by the system he'd designed, refined by his team, and deployed with resources he'd never imagined having at MedTech Solutions. "How's the latency?" Priya asked, leaning over Marcus's shoulder to examine response times. 0.3 seconds average, well within acceptable parameters. Dr. Riley joined them, coffee in hand, looking remarkably alert for the early hour. "The medical staff is nervous," he reported. "They're worried about alert fatigue, about false positives overwhelming their workflows. I've been fielding questions all week." "That's normal," Ethan said, though his own anxiety was building. New systems always create resistance. Once they see it working, once they see Sentinel catching cases they might have missed, the skepticism will fade. "And if it doesn't work?" Marcus asked quietly. "If we have technical failures or the algorithm doesn't perform as well in a larger population?" It was the question that had kept Ethan awake for the past 3 nights. The pilot program at Mercy General had been successful, but controlled. This was different. This was hundreds of patients, diverse populations, real-world chaos that no amount of testing could fully anticipate. "Then we fix it," Ethan said with more confidence than he felt. "We monitor every alert, analyze every outcome, and we iterate. That's how this works. We learn and we improve." The training session began at 7. Ethan stood before 60 medical professionals, doctors, nurses, physician assistants, the people who would actually use Sentinel in their daily practice. They looked tired, skeptical, and vaguely resentful of having to learn yet another new system. He recognized the expression. Healthcare workers were constantly bombarded with technological solutions that promised to make their lives easier, but usually just added complexity. "I know you're busy," Ethan began, abandoning his prepared remarks. "I know you didn't wake up this morning excited about learning a new monitoring system. And I know that every few months, someone shows up promising that their technology will revolutionize healthcare, and mostly what it does is create more paperwork and more headaches." A few people smiled. The tension in the room eased slightly. Sentinel is different, but not because it's more sophisticated or more expensive or more anything. It's different because it's designed to work with you, not replace you. The algorithm doesn't make diagnoses. It doesn't override your clinical judgment. All it does is notice patterns in patient data that might indicate developing problems, and it brings those patterns to your attention. What you do with that information is entirely up to you. He pulled up a case study on the projection screen, the same Robert Chen example he'd used with the hospital administrators. But this time, he focused on the clinical decision-making process. When Sentinel flagged this patient, the attending nurse received an alert on her tablet. Not an alarm, not a crisis notification, just a quiet flag suggesting she might want to take a closer look at this particular patient. She consulted with the physician, they reviewed the data together, and they made the call to start preventive treatment. The system gave them information. They made the decision. That's the relationship we're building here. A doctor in the front row raised her hand. She was in her 50s, with the confident bearing of someone who'd spent decades in emergency medicine. "What's the false positive rate? Because if we're chasing ghosts half the time, that's worse than useless. That's dangerous." "In our pilot program, the false positive rate was approximately 11%, Ethan answered honestly, meaning that in 11% of flagged cases, further investigation showed no developing crisis. But here's the important context. In 8 of those cases, the investigation revealed other issues that warranted attention: medication interactions, early signs of cardiac stress, kidney function decline. So while they weren't sepsis cases, they weren't actually false positives. They were catches of different problems. "And the other 3%? The doctor pressed. "Genuine false alarms. The algorithm saw patterns that turned out to be statistical noise rather than clinical significance. We're working to reduce that number, but I won't pretend it will ever reach 0. Pattern recognition in complex systems always involves some degree of uncertainty." Another hand went up, this time from a young nurse who looked fresh out of training. "What if we disagree with the alert? What if Sentinel flags someone and we think it's wrong?" "Then you document your reasoning and move on," Ethan said simply. "The system creates a record of the alert and your response. If you're right and the alert was spurious, that data helps us refine the algorithm. If you're wrong and the patient deteriorates, that data is available for quality review. But there's no punishment for professional disagreement with the system. Your clinical judgment is paramount." The questions continued for another 30 minutes, ranging from technical details about how the alerts would be delivered to practical concerns about workflow integration. Ethan answered each one as honestly as he could, never overselling the system's capabilities, always emphasizing that Sentinel was a tool, not a replacement for human expertise. By the time the session ended, the mood in the room had shifted from skeptical to cautiously optimistic. Several staff members approached with additional questions, and Ethan found himself engaged in the kind of detailed clinical discussions that reminded him why he'd wanted to work in medical technology in the first place. These people cared deeply about their patients. They wanted tools that would help them provide better care. If Sentinel could prove itself worthy of their trust, it would succeed. The first alert came at 2:17 that afternoon. Ethan was in the hospital cafeteria grabbing a sandwich when his phone buzzed with a notification from the monitoring system. He pulled up the dashboard, his heart rate accelerating as he read the details. Patient ID 47878-2-B, post-operative recovery, subtle pattern shifts indicating possible developing infection. The alert had been sent to the assigned nurse and attending physician. He watched the data stream in real time, saw the nurse access the patient's full chart within 90 seconds of the alert. 5 minutes later, a consult note appeared in the system. The medical team was ordering blood cultures and starting precautionary antibiotics. Sentinel had just made its first catch at St. Catherine's. Ethan felt his hands shaking slightly as he set down his phone. This was real. The system was working. A patient whose infection might have gone unnoticed for hours or days was getting early intervention right now, because an algorithm he'd designed 3 years ago had recognized a pattern in their vital signs. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Priya said, sliding into the seat across from him with her own lunch tray. "First alert just came through," Ethan said, showing her his phone. The team responded perfectly. Early intervention is already underway. Priya's face lit up with the kind of genuine excitement that reminded Ethan why he loved working with her. "That's incredible. We should monitor the case, see how it progresses." They spent the rest of lunch discussing the technical details of the alert, the response time, the data patterns that had triggered the flag. It was the kind of conversation that would bore most people to tears, but felt electric to them. The intersection of theory and practice, of technology and human life. Over the next week, Sentinel flagged 17 cases at St. Catherine's. 14 resulted in early interventions that the medical staff agreed were warranted. 2 were determined to be false positives after investigation. 1 was still being evaluated. The medical staff's initial skepticism was giving way to something more valuable: trust. Dr. Elena Morrison, the emergency medicine physician who'd questioned the false positive rate during training, stopped Ethan in the hallway 3 days into the deployment. "Your system caught something last night that I would have missed," she said without preamble. 78-year-old woman came in with what looked like a mild UTI. Sentinel flagged her within 2 hours of admission. "I almost dismissed the alert. Her vitals looked fine to me. But I ordered the blood cultures anyway, just to be sure." She paused, and Ethan saw something like grudging respect in her expression. Early-stage sepsis. If we'd waited for obvious symptoms, we'd have been fighting a much harder battle. As it is, she's responding well to treatment. "I'm glad the system helped," Ethan said, trying to keep the triumph out of his voice. "Don't get cocky," Morrison said, but she was almost smiling. "It's one case, but it's a good start. Your team did solid work." Similar stories emerged throughout the first week. A post-surgical patient whose wound infection was caught before it progressed to systemic involvement. A diabetic patient whose subtle metabolic changes indicated developing complications. A cardiac patient whose early signs of organ stress were identified and addressed before acute crisis developed. But success at one hospital didn't mean smooth implementation everywhere. The second site, Regional Memorial in Ohio, struggled with technical integration issues. Their legacy computer systems couldn't communicate properly with Sentinel's data architecture, causing delays and incomplete information feeds. Marcus spent 72 hours straight debugging the connection protocols sustained by coffee and determination until finally the data stream synchronized. The third site, Coastal General in South Carolina, faced different challenges. Their medical staff was overwhelmed and understaffed, and adding a new monitoring system, even one designed to help, felt like another burden. Alert fatigue became a real problem, as overworked nurses simply couldn't respond to every flag with the thoroughness the system required. Ethan flew down to South Carolina to meet with the staff personally. He sat in on shift changes, listened to complaints and concerns, and realized that the problem wasn't the technology. It was the implementation. They'd rolled out Sentinel without adequately addressing the underlying workflow problems that made the staff resistant to any change. "We can't fix your staffing issues," Ethan told the hospital administrator bluntly, "but we can adjust how Sentinel integrates with your existing workflows. We can filter alerts based on acuity levels, route them to specific roles, and build in protocols that account for your staff limitations." Working with Dr. Riley and the on-site charge nurses, they reconfigured the alert system to be less intrusive but still effective. Instead of every flag going to the bedside nurse, high-priority alerts went to a dedicated rapid response coordinator who could triage and escalate appropriately. Lower-priority flags were batched and reviewed during scheduled patient assessments rather than interrupting ongoing care. Within 2 weeks, Coastal General's resistance transformed into engagement. The staff appreciated that the team had listened to their concerns and adapted rather than insisting they adapt to an inflexible system. By early January, Sentinel was live in 8 of the 13 approved hospital networks. The data was compelling. Early intervention rates were up across all sites. Average time to sepsis diagnosis had dropped by an average of 14 hours. Mortality rates for flagged cases were significantly lower than historical averages. But the real measure of success wasn't in the statistics. It was in the emails and messages Ethan received from medical staff describing the patients whose lives had been saved. The grandmother who was discharged in time for her grandson's birthday. The young father who developed post-operative complications that Sentinel caught before they became catastrophic. The teenager with an undiagnosed autoimmune condition whose septic episode was identified and treated within hours of onset. Each message was a reminder that this work mattered in the most fundamental way possible. They were saving lives. Not theoretically, not eventually, but right now, today, in hospitals across 8 states. Oliver noticed the change in his father. Ethan was working long hours again, but they felt different than the desperate weekend sessions in empty conference rooms. Now he came home energized rather than depleted, excited to tell his son about the day's successes and challenges. Oliver didn't always understand the technical details, but he understood that his dad was doing something important, something that helped people. "Is this because of Mom?" Oliver asked one evening as Ethan tucked him into bed. The question caught Ethan off guard. "What do you mean?" "The thing you're doing at work, the system that helps sick people. Is it because Mom got sick and died?" Ethan sat down on the edge of the bed, choosing his words carefully. "Yes and no. I designed the system before Mom got sick because I thought it was important. But after she died, I understood how important in a different way. I understood what it feels like to be the family member hoping the doctors catch something in time. So yes, losing Mom made this work more personal, more meaningful." Oliver was quiet for a moment, processing. "Do you think if your system had been in Mom's hospital, she would have lived?" The question landed like a physical blow. Ethan had asked himself the same thing 1,000 times, had run Sarah's medical data through Sentinel's algorithm in the quiet hours when he couldn't sleep, had seen the flag that would have appeared 18 hours before her septic shock. "Maybe," Ethan said honestly, "the system would have noticed the patterns in her data. The doctors might have started treatment earlier. But I can't know for sure, Ollie. Medicine isn't perfect. Sometimes people get sick in ways we can't fix, even when we do everything right." "But you're trying to make it better," Oliver said, "so other kids don't lose their moms." "Yeah, buddy, that's exactly what I'm trying to do." Oliver nodded, satisfied, and snuggled deeper under his covers. "I think that's good. I think Mom would think it's good too." After Oliver fell asleep, Ethan returned to the living room and found himself staring at the family tree still hanging on the refrigerator. 3 handprints, red, blue, purple. A visual representation of loss and persistence. His phone buzzed with an email from Victoria. She was in Boston at one of the implementation sites, observing the system in action. The message was brief, but warm. "The staff at New England Medical are enthusiastic about Sentinel. Dr. Riley's training protocols are working well. You've built something remarkable, Ethan. Elena would have loved seeing this." He typed a response. "Thank you for making it possible. For believing it was worth the investment." Her reply came quickly. "I didn't invest in a technology. I invested in a vision. Your vision. Never forget that this success belongs to you." Ethan set down his phone, feeling the weight of her words. A year ago, he'd been a man on the edge of collapse, barely holding his life together, convinced he was failing at everything that mattered. Now he was leading a team, deploying technology across multiple states, saving lives in measurable, concrete ways. The transformation still felt surreal sometimes, but it was real. He'd earned it through persistence and honesty and the willingness to turn his worst experience into fuel for something meaningful. In late January, the board of directors meeting took place at Helix headquarters. Victoria had asked Ethan to present the Sentinel deployment results and outline the roadmap for expanding to the remaining hospital networks. He'd presented to administrators and medical staff dozens of times by now, but presenting to the board felt different. These were the people who controlled budgets and strategic direction, who could kill projects with a single vote. The boardroom was intimidating, wood paneling, leather chairs, a massive table that seemed designed to make people feel small. The directors were exactly what Ethan expected. Older, wealthy, dressed in expensive suits, radiating the kind of power that came from decades of corporate experience. Victoria introduced him with her usual efficiency. This is Ethan Cole, Director of Medical AI Development and soon to be Vice President of our new Medical Technology Division. He'll be presenting the Sentinel deployment results. Ethan pulled up his presentation on the room's display screens and began walking through the data. Implementation timeline, hospital participation rates, clinical outcomes, financial projections. He kept it factual and straightforward, knowing this audience cared more about numbers than emotional appeals. The questions came fast and pointed. Return on investment timelines, liability concerns, scalability limitations, competitive positioning. Ethan fielded each one, drawing on the expertise of his team and his own growing confidence in the project's value proposition. Then a director Ethan didn't recognize, a man in his 60s with silver hair and an expensive watch, raised his hand. Mr. Cole, I've reviewed the financial projections, and while they're promising, I'm concerned about the opportunity cost. Helix has traditionally focused on corporate IT solutions with predictable revenue streams and high margins. This medical technology venture is capital-intensive, highly regulated, and frankly, risky. Why should we continue pouring resources into this instead of doubling down on our core business? It was a fair question, even if it felt like an attack. Ethan took a breath, considering his response. You're right that medical technology is riskier and more complex than corporate IT, he said carefully. But it's also more important. Our corporate solutions help businesses run more efficiently. That's valuable. But Sentinel saves lives, literally, measurably saves lives. In the 3 months since deployment began, we've documented 247 early interventions that resulted in improved patient outcomes. Based on historical mortality rates for similar cases, we estimate we've prevented approximately 63 deaths. He pulled up a slide showing patient outcome data, not just numbers, but briefcase summaries. Real people with names and faces. I understand that from a pure financial perspective, this might seem like a questionable investment, Ethan continued. But companies don't just exist to maximize shareholder return. They exist to create value in the world. Sentinel creates immense value. It makes hospitals safer. It reduces healthcare costs through earlier, less intensive interventions. And yes, it saves lives. That's worth the risk. The silver-haired director leaned back in his chair, studying Ethan with an unreadable expression. You make a compelling case, Mr. Cole, but sentiment doesn't pay the bills. Can this division become profitable within a reasonable time frame? Yes, Ethan said without hesitation. Our projections show break-even within 4 years, with significant growth potential after that. We're already in negotiations with 2 major insurance companies who are interested in subsidizing Sentinel deployment because it reduces their long-term costs. We have interest from international hospital networks. And we're developing additional applications of the core technology that will diversify our revenue streams. What kind of additional applications? This was where things got exciting. Ethan pulled up the next section of his presentation, showing the research roadmap his team had been developing. Sentinel's core strength is pattern recognition in complex physiological data. That same approach can be applied to cardiac event prediction, stroke risk assessment, medication interaction monitoring, even early detection of certain cancers through subtle metabolic changes. We're not just building a sepsis detection system, we're building a platform for preventive medicine. The market potential is enormous. The board members exchanged glances. Victoria, sitting at the head of the table, allowed the slightest smile to cross her face. The silver-haired director who'd raised the concerns nodded slowly. All right, Mr. Cole. You've made your case. I'm still cautious about the risks, but I can see the potential. I'll support continued funding for the division. Other directors chimed in with approval, though several raised concerns about oversight and accountability. By the time the presentation ended, Ethan had secured commitment for the expansion budget and approval for the new organizational structure that would officially create the Medical Technology Division with Victoria as Chief Innovation Officer and himself as VP of AI Development. As the board members filed out, Victoria approached him. Well done, she said quietly. You handled Richardson's skepticism perfectly. He's usually our toughest critic, but you won him over. I just told him the truth, Ethan said, feeling the adrenaline from the presentation starting to fade. This work matters more than profit margins. The truth delivered with passion and data, Victoria corrected. That's a rare combination. Most people lead with one or the other. You integrated both seamlessly. They walked together toward the elevators, the post-presentation exhaustion settling over Ethan like a blanket. There's something I wanted to discuss with you, Victoria said as they waited for the elevator. My transition out of the CEO role is happening faster than anticipated. The board has already selected my replacement, internal promotion, someone who knows the company well. I'll be stepping into the CIO role officially on March 1st. That's only 5 weeks away, Ethan said, surprised. Yes, which means we need to accelerate some of our planning for the medical technology division. I'd like you to take a more prominent role in external communications, conference presentations, media interviews, industry partnerships. You're the face of Sentinel now, and I think it's important for people to understand that this project is driven by genuine purpose, not just corporate strategy. The thought of media interviews made Ethan's stomach clench. I'm not sure I'm the right person for that. I'm better with algorithms than with cameras. You're exactly the right person, Victoria insisted. Because you're authentic. You don't have the polished veneer of a corporate spokesperson. When you talk about why this work matters, people believe you because they can see it's personal. That authenticity is powerful. Before Ethan could respond, his phone rang. The caller ID showed St. Catherine's Medical Center, the first implementation site. He glanced at Victoria apologetically. Take it, she said. I'll talk to you tomorrow about the communication strategy, Ethan answered as he stepped into the elevator. This is Ethan Cole. Mr. Cole, this is Dr. Morrison from St. Catherine's. Her voice was tense, urgent. We have a situation you need to know about. His heart rate spiked. What kind of situation? Sentinel flagged a patient 2 hours ago. 64-year-old male, admitted for observation after a minor cardiac event. The attending physician dismissed the alert as a false positive. The patient's vitals looked stable, he was conversational and coherent, no obvious signs of distress. But 30 minutes ago, he crashed, full septic shock. We've got him stabilized now, but it was close, very close. Ethan leaned against the elevator wall, processing the information. This was exactly the scenario they'd trained staff to avoid, dismissing alerts without thorough investigation. Did the physician document why they dismissed the alert? He asked, keeping his voice level despite the anxiety coursing through him. Yes. He noted that the patient's lactate levels were within normal range and there were no fever spikes. He thought Sentinel was reacting to baseline irregularities in the patient's cardiac rhythm rather than detecting infection. But Sentinel doesn't flag based on single metrics, Ethan said, frustrated. It looks at pattern correlations across multiple data streams. What did the full analysis show? In retrospect, subtle inflammatory markers that weren't individually concerning but collectively indicated developing systemic infection. The physician should have ordered additional tests rather than dismissing the alert outright. Is the patient going to survive? Morrison hesitated. We think so, but it's going to be a harder fight than it should have been. Mr. Cole, I'm calling because this is going to be reviewed by our Quality Assurance Committee. There will be questions about whether the alert was clear enough, whether our training was adequate, whether the system itself might have contributed to the delayed response. The implication was clear. This case could become ammunition for Sentinel's critics, could undermine confidence in the system, could potentially derail the entire deployment if it was mishandled. I'll be there tomorrow morning, Ethan said. We'll review the case together, look at the data, and figure out what we need to improve. But Dr. Morrison, this wasn't a failure of the system. This was a failure to trust the system. Sentinel did exactly what it was designed to do. I know, Morrison said quietly. But that's not going to stop people from asking whether we should be relying on an algorithm over human judgment. After the call ended, Ethan stood in the empty hallway outside the boardroom, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settling over him. One near miss. One case where a physician's dismissal of an alert had nearly cost a patient their life. It was inevitable that something like this would happen eventually. Humans made mistakes. Misjudgments occurred, even with the best training and the best intentions. But it still felt like a failure, like his system, his vision, his promise to prevent unnecessary deaths had fallen short. He called Oliver's after-school program to let them know he'd be late for pickup, then headed back to his office. There was work to do, reviewing the St. Catherine's case data, preparing for tomorrow's meeting, figuring out how to address the concerns that would inevitably arise from this incident. Priya found him there 2 hours later, hunched over his laptop, reviewing the timeline of events that had led to the near disaster. "Marcus told me what happened," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "This wasn't your fault. A patient almost died because a doctor didn't trust the alert," Ethan said without looking up. "That means our training wasn't effective enough. Our alert design wasn't compelling enough. Somewhere in our implementation, we failed. Or somewhere in the hospital's culture, a physician made a bad call," Priya countered. "You can't control human error, Ethan. You can minimize it with good design and good training, but you can't eliminate it. People are going to use this case to argue that Sentinel creates more problems than it solves," Ethan said, finally meeting her eyes. "They're going to say that if the algorithm hadn't flagged the patient, the physician might have been more vigilant. That by creating a false sense of security, we actually made things worse." "That's a garbage argument, and you know it," Priya said bluntly. "Without Sentinel, that patient wouldn't have been flagged at all. The physician might never have considered sepsis until the crash happened. Yes, the alert was dismissed, and yes, that was a mistake. But the alternative isn't better human judgment. It's no early warning at all." She was right. Logically, Ethan knew she was right, but the emotional weight of knowing a patient had suffered because someone hadn't trusted his system felt crushing anyway. "I'm going to Philadelphia tomorrow," Ethan said. "I need to review the case personally, talk to the medical staff, figure out how to prevent this from happening again." "Want company?" Priya asked. "I can bring Marcus. We can do a full technical review, make sure there wasn't anything in the alert delivery or data presentation that contributed to the dismissal." Ethan felt a rush of gratitude for his team, for their loyalty and expertise. "Yeah, that would be helpful. Thank you." That night he picked up Oliver late from the after-school program, apologizing to the staff who'd stayed past their normal hours. Oliver was understanding. He'd grown accustomed to his father's unpredictable schedule, but Ethan still felt the familiar guilt. The work mattered, but so did being present for his son. They got takeout Chinese food and ate it at the kitchen table, Oliver chattering about a project they were doing in art class, while Ethan tried to be present, to listen, to not let his mind drift back to the patient in Philadelphia who'd almost died because a physician hadn't trusted an algorithm. "Dad, you're not listening," Oliver said, his voice cutting through Ethan's distraction. "I'm sorry, buddy. Work stuff. Tell me again about the art project." "I said we're making family portraits. Ms. Chen said we should include people who are important to us, even if they're not here anymore." Oliver paused, his expression serious. "Can I put Mom in my portrait?" The question hit Ethan in the chest. "Of course you can. Mom will always be part of our family. But should I also put Victoria?" Ethan blinked, surprised. "Victoria? Miss Cross for my work?" Oliver nodded. "She came to my after-school program last week. She talked to the counselor and me. She told me about her daughter who died. She seemed sad, like we're sad. Is it okay if I put her in my portrait?" Ethan had no idea Victoria had visited Oliver's program. She'd never mentioned it, had never asked permission. The presumption should have bothered him, but instead he found himself moved by the gesture. Victoria, who kept everyone at arm's length, who'd spent 11 years emotionally frozen, had reached out to his grieving child. "If she's important to you, then yes, you should include her," Ethan said carefully. "But maybe ask her first. Some people don't like being in pictures or portraits." "Okay," Oliver said, satisfied, and returned to his dinner. Later, after Oliver was in bed, Ethan texted Victoria. "Oliver told me you visited his after-school program." "Thank you for that. You didn't have to." Her response came a few minutes later. "I wanted to. He's a remarkable child. You're doing an excellent job with him. Also, heard about the St. Catherine's case. Don't let it derail you. These incidents are learning opportunities, not failures." Ethan appreciated the support, but the weight of responsibility didn't lift. Tomorrow he'd face the Quality Assurance Committee, defend his system, and figure out how to prevent future physicians from making the same dangerous judgment call. The meeting at St. Catherine's was as difficult as Ethan had anticipated. The Quality Assurance Committee consisted of hospital administrators, medical directors, and risk management specialists, all of whom wanted answers about how a Sentinel alert had been dismissed with such serious consequences. Dr. Morrison presented the case timeline with clinical precision. The patient, a retired construction worker named James Fletcher, had been admitted for observation after experiencing chest pain. His cardiac workup showed minor irregularities, but nothing requiring immediate intervention. 48 hours into his hospital stay, Sentinel had flagged him as showing early signs of systemic infection. The attending physician, Dr. Richard Howell, had reviewed the alert and documented his decision to dismiss it based on the patient's stable appearance and lack of classic sepsis symptoms. Mr. Fletcher's lactate was 1.8, well within normal range, Dr. Howell explained, his defensive posture evident. His temperature was 99.4. His white count was mildly elevated but consistent with post-stress response. There were no obvious signs of infection. The alert seemed premature. Ethan reviewed the full data stream on his tablet, seeing exactly what Sentinel had flagged. The algorithm hadn't relied on any single metric. Instead, it had identified a pattern, the correlation between subtle respiratory rate changes, minor inflammatory marker shifts, and developing metabolic acidosis that collectively suggested early-stage infection. The alert wasn't based on obvious symptoms, Ethan said carefully. It was based on pattern recognition. Sentinel caught correlations that weren't individually significant but were collectively concerning. That's the entire point of the system, to identify problems before they become obvious. But if the signs weren't obvious, how was I supposed to know the alert was legitimate? Dr. Howell challenged. We get alerts from multiple systems all day long. I have to triage based on clinical judgment. You're supposed to investigate, Ethan replied, trying to keep frustration out of his voice. The training protocol specifically says that Sentinel alert should trigger additional testing, not immediate treatment. Blood cultures, lactate trending, inflammatory marker panels. The investigation doesn't require you to accept the algorithm's conclusion. It requires you to gather more data before dismissing it. The committee chair, a stern-looking woman named Dr. Patricia Chen, intervened. Mr. Cole, I understand the system's intent, but Dr. Howell raises a valid concern. If we investigate every alert with full lab workups, we're talking about significant costs and patient burden. How do we distinguish between alerts that require immediate investigation and those that can be monitored? It was the fundamental challenge of any early warning system. Set the sensitivity too high and you overwhelm staff with false alarms. Set it too low and you missed critical cases. Sentinel tried to balance these concerns, but the balance was never perfect. Sentinel provides confidence levels with each alert, Priya interjected, pulling up the technical documentation on the conference room screen. Mr. Fletcher's flag was rated as high confidence, meaning the algorithm detected strong pattern correlations. Low confidence alerts suggest investigation during routine assessments. High confidence alerts suggest immediate follow-up. That distinction is built into the system. Was that distinction clear in the alert Dr. Howell received? Dr. Chen asked. Dr. Howell pulled out his tablet, showing the alert exactly as it had appeared. The confidence level was there, but buried in the interface, not prominently displayed. Marcus leaned forward, examining the alert design. That's a user interface issue. The confidence rating should be more prominent. We can fix that in the next update. The meeting continued for 2 more hours, dissecting every aspect of the case, the system design, the training protocols, and the institutional response. By the end, the committee had agreed on several action items: redesigning the alert interface to make confidence levels more prominent, adding mandatory consultation requirements for high-confidence alerts, and conducting refresher training for all medical staff on proper Sentinel response protocols. But they'd also agreed to continue using the system. The data was too compelling, the successful interventions too numerous, to abandon Sentinel because of one near miss. As Ethan packed up his materials after the meeting, Dr. Howell approached him. I want you to know I feel terrible about what happened, the physician said quietly. I thought I was making a reasonable clinical judgment. I didn't understand how serious the alert was. Ethan looked at the man, probably in his 40s, tired eyes, the bearing of someone who'd spent years carrying the weight of life and death decisions. He wasn't incompetent. He wasn't negligent. He just made a mistake in a complex situation. Mr. Fletcher is going to survive, Ethan said. That's what matters. We learn from this, we improve the system, and we prevent the next physician from making the same call. That's how progress works. Dr. Howell nodded, grateful for the absolution. The system is good. I see that now. I just wish I'd trusted it sooner. On the flight back to the city that evening, Ethan sat between Priya and Marcus, reviewing the changes they'd implement to prevent similar incidents. The interface redesign was straightforward. The mandatory consultation protocols would require buy-in from hospital administrators, but were defensible. The refresher training could be rolled out within 2 weeks. We're going to lose some hospitals over this, Marcus said pragmatically. Some administrators are going to see this as proof that algorithmic medicine is too risky. Maybe, Ethan agreed, but most will see it as proof that we're responsive and committed to continuous improvement. We identified a problem, we took responsibility, and we're fixing it. That builds trust. Priya looked at him with something like admiration. You've gotten really good at this leadership thing. The Ethan Cole from a year ago would have been drowning in guilt over what happened. This version of you is already focused on solutions. Had he changed that much? Ethan considered it. A year ago, he'd been barely holding his life together, consumed by grief and fear. Now he was leading a team, deploying life-saving technology, facing challenges with something approaching confidence. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it no longer defined him. I had good teachers, Ethan said, gesturing at both of them, and good motivation. This work is too important to let setbacks derail us. When he arrived home that night, exhausted and emotionally drained, he found Victoria's car parked outside his apartment building. She was sitting on the front steps, wrapped in a wool coat against the February cold. Victoria, what are you doing here? She stood, brushing off her coat. I wanted to check on you. I know today was difficult. You didn't have to come all the way here. You could have just called. I could have, Victoria agreed, but I wanted to see for myself that you were all right. May I come in? It was the first time Victoria had ever been to his apartment. Ethan felt suddenly self-conscious about the modest space, the worn furniture, the scattered evidence of single fatherhood, Oliver's backpack by the door, drawings on the refrigerator, dishes in the sink. Victoria didn't seem to notice or care. She accepted his offer of tea and settled at the kitchen table while he put the kettle on. Oliver's asleep? She asked. Yeah, school night. He goes down around 8:30. He told me he wants to include me in his family portrait, Victoria said, and something in her voice suggested the idea had affected her deeply. I wanted to ask your permission before I said yes. Ethan turned from the stove, surprised. He's 7 years old. If he wants you in his portrait, that's his choice. You don't need my permission. I think I do, Victoria said quietly, because it means I'm becoming part of his life in a meaningful way, and I need to know that you're comfortable with that you trust me to be present for him. The vulnerability in her admission was striking. This was Victoria Cross, who'd built a corporate empire, who commanded boardrooms with ease, asking permission to matter to a grieving child. Oliver lost his mother, Ethan said carefully, bringing 2 mugs of tea to the table. He spent a year watching me struggle to be enough for him when I'm clearly not. If he's found someone else who makes him feel safe, who understands his grief in ways I can't because I'm too close to it, then yes, I'm comfortable with that. More than comfortable. Grateful. Victoria wrapped her hands around the warm mug, not drinking, just holding it. I didn't expect to care about him. I thought I could stay professional, distant. But he's remarkable, Ethan. He's so brave and so fragile at the same time. When he talks about Sarah, when he tries so hard to be strong for you, it breaks my heart and inspires me simultaneously. He's the best thing I've ever done, Ethan said. The only thing I'm certain I didn't fail at, even in my worst moments. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, 2 people who'd found an unexpected connection through parallel losses. The committee agreed to continue using Sentinel, Ethan said eventually, with modifications to prevent future incidents like the Fletcher case. But it was close. If he'd died, if the outcome had been different, we might have lost everything. But he didn't die, Victoria pointed out. And you handled the crisis with professionalism and accountability. That's all anyone can ask. I keep thinking about all the ways this could have gone wrong, Ethan admitted. All the variables I can't control. What if the next hospital has a worse near miss? What if the algorithm misses a case entirely? What if you drive yourself to exhaustion worrying about hypotheticals? Victoria interrupted gently. Ethan, perfection isn't possible. Not in technology, not in medicine, not in life. All we can do is build the best systems we can, respond honestly when problems arise, and keep improving. You're already doing that. She was right, but the anxiety didn't fully release its grip. How do you handle it? Ethan asked. The weight of knowing that your decisions affect people's lives, that mistakes have consequences you can't take back? Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her fingers still wrapped around her cooling tea. I used to handle it by not feeling anything, she said finally, by treating everything as a strategic problem rather than a human one. It was effective but empty. Now I handle it by accepting that I'll carry the weight of those decisions regardless, so I might as well make choices I can be proud of. Sentinel might not save everyone, but it will save some. That's enough. They talked until almost midnight, the conversation ranging from technical challenges to personal struggles to the strange, unexpected friendship that had developed between them. When Victoria finally stood to leave, she hesitated at the door. "Thank you for letting me be part of this," she said. "The project, yes, but also your family. I didn't realize how much I needed that until Oliver asked if he could draw me in his portrait." "Thank you for pulling me out of the darkness," Ethan replied, "for seeing something in me worth saving when I couldn't see it myself." After she left, Ethan checked on Oliver one last time before heading to bed. His son slept peacefully, one arm wrapped around his stuffed rabbit, completely unaware of the complex adult world swirling around him. The family portrait Oliver was working on sat on his desk, rough sketches showing 4 figures: red for Oliver, blue for Ethan, purple for Sarah, and a new color, gray, for Victoria. 4 handprints instead of 3, a family that was reshaping itself, building connections across loss, finding unexpected sources of strength. Ethan climbed into bed, exhausted but no longer drowning. The work ahead was daunting, more hospitals to implement, more challenges to overcome, more lives hanging in the balance. But for the first time since Sarah's death, he felt capable of carrying that weight. Not alone. Never alone again. With his team, with Victoria, with Oliver, and with the memory of the woman whose death had transformed into purpose, Ethan was building something that would outlast them all. Something worth fighting for. By March, Sentinel was operating in all 13 approved hospital networks, monitoring over 38,000 patients across 152 facilities. The data coming in was extraordinary. Early intervention rates had improved by 74% compared to pre-implementation baselines. Average hospital stays for flagged infection cases had decreased by 6 days. Mortality rates for detected sepsis cases had dropped to single digits. The numbers told a compelling story, but Ethan had learned that numbers alone didn't capture the full impact. Behind every statistic was a person who'd gone home to their family instead of ending up in a morgue, a grandmother who'd made it to her granddaughter's wedding, a firefighter who'd returned to work after what should have been a fatal post-operative infection, a college student who'd survived meningitis because Sentinel caught the subtle warning signs 12 hours before anyone else would have noticed. Victoria's transition to Chief Innovation Officer had been announced in late February, and with it came a media blitz that thrust both her and Ethan into the public spotlight. Healthcare technology publications wanted interviews. Medical conferences extended speaking invitations. News outlets picked up the story of the CEO who'd stepped away from corporate power to focus on saving lives. Ethan found himself sitting across from a reporter at a downtown coffee shop on a Wednesday afternoon, trying to explain Sentinel in terms that wouldn't make readers' eyes glaze over. "So the system is like an early warning radar for infections?" the reporter, a woman in her 30s named Jennifer Park, asked as she reviewed her notes. "That's a reasonable analogy," Ethan said, "though it's more sophisticated than just detecting infections. The algorithm looks for patterns of systemic distress that might indicate any number of critical conditions. And this technology exists because your wife died from sepsis?" The personal question caught him off guard, though he should have expected it. The narrative of grief transformed into innovation was compelling, and journalists loved compelling narratives. "Sarah's death made me understand the stakes in a way I couldn't when I was just designing theoretical systems," Ethan said carefully. "But the technology exists because hospitals needed better tools for early detection. I'm just fortunate that I was in a position to help build those tools." Jennifer leaned forward, her expression sympathetic but persistent. but it must feel personal every time the system saves a life. Every patient who survives because of Sentinel is someone else's wife or husband or child who doesn't have to go through what you went through. Ethan took a sip of his coffee, buying time to formulate a response that was honest without being maudlin. It does feel personal, but not in a redemptive way. Sarah's death doesn't become less tragic because Sentinel exists. What changes is that future deaths become more preventable. That's not the same as undoing what happened, but it's something. The interview continued for another 30 minutes, covering technical details, implementation challenges, and future plans for expanding Sentinel's capabilities. When Jennifer finally turned off her recorder, she smiled. This is going to be a great story. The human interest angle combined with legitimate technological innovation. That's rare in healthcare reporting. Just make sure the technical details are accurate, Ethan requested. I'd rather be boring and correct than compelling and wrong. I'll do my best, Jennifer promised, gathering her materials. Though honestly, Mr. Cole, you're more compelling than you give yourself credit for. After she left, Ethan remained at the coffee shop reviewing emails on his phone. One from Marcus flagged a potential integration issue at a hospital in Michigan. Another from Priya suggested modifications to the algorithm that could improve detection rates for certain types of bacterial infections. A third from Dr. Riley requested his presence at a medical conference in Chicago where Sentinel would be featured in a keynote presentation. His phone buzzed with a call. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize with a local area code. He answered cautiously. "Is this Ethan Cole?" The voice was male, older, with an edge of hostility that immediately put Ethan on alert. "Yes? Who's calling?" "My name is Richard Brennan. I was the Chief Technology Officer at MedTech Solutions before Helix acquired us. I think we need to have a conversation about Sentinel and some intellectual property concerns I've recently become aware of." Ethan's stomach dropped. Richard Brennan. He remembered the name, a senior executive at MedTech who'd been let go during the acquisition. Brennan had opposed the Sentinel project from the beginning, arguing it was too expensive and too risky. When Helix bought the company and made it clear they wanted Sentinel specifically, Brennan had been furious. "What kind of intellectual property concerns?" Ethan asked, keeping his voice neutral. "The kind where the algorithm you're currently deploying across multiple hospital networks bears suspicious similarity to work I was developing before you joined MedTech Solutions. The kind where credit and compensation might be going to the wrong person." It was a threat, thinly veiled but unmistakable. Ethan felt anger flash through him, followed quickly by concern. Brennan couldn't possibly have a legitimate claim to Sentinel's core technology. Ethan had designed it from scratch, building on publicly available research and his own original work. But legitimate or not, an intellectual property dispute could tie up the project in legal proceedings for months or years. "Mr. Brennan, I designed Sentinel's algorithm personally. Every line of code, every pattern recognition matrix, every decision tree. If you have concerns about intellectual property, you should direct them to Helix's legal department, not to me personally." "Oh, I will," Brennan said, his tone suggesting satisfaction at having rattled Ethan. "I just wanted to give you a heads up that this is coming. Professional courtesy, since we used to be colleagues." The call ended before Ethan could respond. He sat staring at his phone, processing what had just happened. This wasn't professional courtesy. This was a warning shot, possibly the opening move in a campaign to undermine Sentinel or extract settlement money from Helix. He called Victoria immediately. She answered on the second ring. "Ethan, I'm in a meeting. Can this wait?" "Richard Brennan just called me. He's threatening an intellectual property lawsuit over Sentinel." There was a brief pause, then Victoria's voice came back crisp and focused. "I'll call you back in 5 minutes." True to her word, his phone rang exactly 5 minutes later. "Tell me everything he said," Victoria instructed. Ethan recounted the conversation word for word. When he finished, Victoria was silent for a moment, thinking. Brennan left MedTech Solutions on bad terms. He felt the acquisition was mishandled and blamed several people, including you, for the company being sold rather than pursuing independent growth. This sounds like revenge more than legitimate legal concern. "Can he actually make a case?" Ethan asked. "I mean, I know I designed Sentinel, but what if he claims he contributed foundational work that I built on?" "Did he?" No, absolutely not. Brennan was focused on consumer health apps, not hospital-grade diagnostic systems. Our work never overlapped. Then we'll fight it, Victoria said with certainty. I'm forwarding this to our legal department immediately. They'll review your original research documentation, your employment contracts, everything that establishes your ownership of the intellectual property. And Ethan, do not engage with Brennan directly anymore. If he contacts you again, refer him to our attorneys. This could derail everything, Ethan said, feeling the familiar weight of anxiety settling over him. If hospitals think the technology is tied up in legal disputes, they'll pull out. We could lose years of work. Or we could make an example of a disgruntled former executive trying to sabotage a life-saving project, Victoria countered. Trust me, Ethan, we have resources Brennan can't match. And more importantly, we have the truth on our side. After the call ended, Ethan tried to focus on his other work, but Brennan's threat kept intruding on his thoughts. Everything they'd built, all the lives Sentinel was saving, could be jeopardized by one vindictive man with an axe to grind. That evening, he picked up Oliver from the after-school program and took him to their favorite pizza place. Oliver had finished his family portrait and he showed it to Ethan with obvious pride. The four figures were rendered in a child's hand, but with surprising emotional depth. Red Oliver stood in the center, flanked by blue Ethan on one side and gray Victoria on the other. Purple Sarah floated above them, not quite separate but not quite present, a visual representation of memory's complicated relationship with the living. Ms. Chen said it was very creative, Oliver reported. She asked if I wanted to explain it to the class, but I said no. Why not? Ethan asked gently. Oliver shrugged, focusing intently on his pizza. Because they wouldn't understand. They have regular families. They don't have someone who's here but not here. The observation was so perceptive it made Ethan's chest ache. His 7-year-old son had articulated something profound about grief and memory that most adults struggled to express. Not everyone has regular families, buddy. Lots of people have complicated situations, but I understand why you didn't want to explain. Some things are private. Victoria understood, Oliver said, brightening slightly. I showed her at after school and she said it was perfect. She said that's exactly how she thinks about Elena. Here, but not here. Victoria had been spending more time with Oliver lately, Ethan had noticed. She'd show up at school events, take him for ice cream occasionally, sit with him during art therapy sessions at the after-school program. Their relationship had developed organically, built on shared understanding of loss. I'm glad you have her, Ethan said. She's pretty special. Are you going to marry her? Oliver asked with the casual directness of childhood. Ethan nearly choked on his pizza. What? No. Where did that come from? Jacob at school said when grown-ups spend lots of time together and his dad spends time with his kid, it means they're going to get married. You and Victoria spend lots of time together. She spends time with me. So I thought maybe Victoria and I are friends, Ethan said carefully. Good friends. We work together and we care about each other, but that's different from the kind of relationship that leads to marriage. But you're not sad all the time anymore when you're with her, Oliver observed. You smile more. You laugh sometimes. Isn't that what happens when people like each other? The conversation was veering into territory Ethan wasn't prepared to navigate. He hadn't thought about Victoria in romantic terms. Their connection was built on professional collaboration and shared grief, not attraction. Or was it? He examined his feelings more carefully, the comfort he felt in her presence. The way her rare smiles made him feel accomplished. The late-night conversations that went beyond work into genuine personal connection. Sometimes adults can really care about each other without it being romantic, Ethan said, hoping that was true and not just what he wanted to believe. Victoria and I have a special friendship. That might change someday, or it might not, but right now, we're focused on being there for each other, and for you. Is that okay? Oliver considered this with the seriousness of a judge deliberating a verdict. Yeah, that's okay. I like her. If you wanted to marry her, I would be okay with that too, just so you know. I'll keep that in mind, Ethan said, suppressing a smile. The legal threat from Brennan materialized 3 days later in the form of a formal cease and desist letter delivered to Helix's headquarters. The document was thick with legalese, but the core claim was clear. Brennan alleged that he had developed preliminary algorithms for early infection detection during his tenure at MedTech Solutions, and that Ethan had appropriated this work without credit or compensation. Victoria called an emergency meeting with Helix's legal team, the Medical Technology Division leadership, and Ethan. They gathered in the main conference room, the atmosphere tense. "Let's be clear about what we're dealing with," said Amanda Chen, Helix's chief legal counsel. She was in her 40s, sharp-eyed and precise. "Brennan is claiming joint ownership of Sentinel's core intellectual property. If he can prove that claim, he could be entitled to a percentage of licensing fees, royalties, and potentially decision-making authority over how the technology is deployed." "He can't prove it because it isn't true," Ethan said flatly. "I never worked with Brennan on anything related to Sentinel. His focus was consumer applications. Mine was hospital systems. Our paths barely crossed." "Do you have documentation proving that?" Amanda asked. "Yes. My original research notes, dated and time-stamped. Email correspondence with MedTech's medical consultants. Code repositories showing version history. Everything that demonstrates independent development." Amanda nodded, making notes. "Good. That's what we need. But here's the complication. Brennan doesn't need to win to hurt us. He just needs to create enough uncertainty to make hospital administrators nervous. If he files a formal lawsuit, even one will eventually win, it creates negative publicity and legal clouds over the technology." "So what do we do?" Priya asked. "Settle? Pay him off to make him go away?" "Absolutely not," Victoria said, her voice cold. "That would validate his claims and invite future extortion attempts. We fight this." "Fighting means discovery, depositions, potentially years of litigation," Amanda warned. "It means Ethan's personal history becomes public record. It means media attention on the dispute rather than the technology's success." Ethan felt the room's attention shift to him. This was his decision as much as anyone's. He could push for settlement, make the problem disappear with money, protect the project from prolonged uncertainty, or he could fight, defend his work, but risk everything in the process. He thought about Sarah, about the 18 hours between when Sentinel would have flagged her case and when she'd crashed into septic shock, about the families whose loved ones were alive because of early intervention, about Oliver's family portrait with its 4 handprints representing a family cobbled together from loss and determination. "We fight," Ethan said. "Brennan is lying, and I won't reward lies. If he wants a legal battle, we'll give him one." Victoria's expression showed approval. "Then we're in agreement. Amanda, file whatever counter motions are appropriate. Make it clear that we consider this a frivolous claim and will seek damages for any harm it causes to our business operations." Over the following weeks, the legal battle intensified. Brennan's attorneys filed additional documents claiming that Ethan had accessed Brennan's research files during his time at MedTech and incorporated proprietary methodologies into Sentinel's design. Helix's legal team responded with evidence that Brennan's alleged research was nothing but vague concept documents with no functional algorithms or implementation details. The dispute leaked to the press, as such things inevitably did. Healthcare publications ran stories questioning Sentinel's origins. Some hospital administrators contacted Helix expressing concerns about continuing with the implementation until the legal issues were resolved. Ethan found himself defending the technology's legitimacy in media interviews, conference presentations, and direct communications with nervous hospital partners. It was exhausting and demoralizing, watching something they'd worked so hard to build be undermined by baseless accusations. "This is exactly what Brennan wanted," Marcus said during a team meeting where they reviewed the latest round of negative coverage. "He's succeeding in creating doubt, even though he doesn't have a case." "Then we need to change the narrative," Priya suggested. "Stop playing defense. Go on offense." "What do you mean?" Ethan asked. "I mean, we release the data, all of it. Every case Sentinel has flagged, every successful intervention, every life saved. We make it impossible for anyone to argue that this technology is anything other than essential. We shift the conversation from who owns it to who benefits from it." Dr. Riley looked thoughtful. "That could work. If we get patient consent and anonymize the data appropriately, we could publish a comprehensive outcomes study. Peer-reviewed, academically rigorous. It would establish Sentinel's credibility independent of the legal dispute." "It would also put enormous pressure on Brennan," Victoria added. It's one thing to claim intellectual property rights to an algorithm. It's another thing entirely to be seen as trying to sabotage a technology that's saving hundreds of lives. Public opinion matters in cases like this. They worked around the clock to compile the data, reaching out to every hospital in the network for permission to include their outcomes in the study. The response was overwhelming. Medical directors who'd seen Sentinel work were eager to contribute their data to prove the system's value. Dr. Riley led the academic writing effort, collaborating with infectious disease specialists and biostatisticians to ensure the study met rigorous publication standards. The final document was over 80 pages of dense medical analysis, but the conclusions were clear and compelling. Sentinel improved early detection rates by 78%, reduced mortality and flagged cases by 64%, and decreased average hospital costs per sepsis case by 41%. They submitted the study to the Journal of Medical Technology, one of the most prestigious publications in the field. Peer review would take months, but they also released a preprint version publicly, making the data available to anyone who wanted to review it. The impact was immediate. News outlets picked up the story, now framing it not as a legal dispute, but as a battle between innovation and obstruction. Patient advocacy groups began speaking out in support of Sentinel. Medical professionals who'd seen the system work wrote op-eds defending its legitimacy, and hospital administrators who'd been wavering recommitted to the implementation. Within 2 weeks of the study's release, 3 new hospital networks reached out to Helix requesting information about joining the program. Brennan's legal position began to crumble. Faced with overwhelming evidence of Sentinel's independent development and growing public pressure, his attorneys withdrew several of their more aggressive claims. The cease and desist letter was quietly retracted. By mid-April, Brennan's entire case had collapsed. Amanda Chen delivered the news during a conference call with Victoria and Ethan. Brennan's legal team has indicated they're willing to settle for a nominal payment and a public acknowledgement that disputes were resolved amicably. It's essentially a face-saving withdrawal. What are they asking for? Victoria inquired. $50,000 and a joint statement saying both parties recognize each other's contributions to medical technology development at MedTech Solutions. That's acceptable, Victoria said. Ethan thought about it. $50,000 was nothing in the context of Sentinel's budget, and the statement was vague enough that it didn't concede anything meaningful. Most importantly, it would end the distraction and let them focus on the actual work. Agreed, he said. Let's close this out. The settlement was finalized within a week. Brennan disappeared from the story as quickly as he'd appeared, his attempt at sabotage failing to achieve anything except briefly inconveniencing people who had better things to do. But the crisis had produced an unexpected benefit. The comprehensive outcomes study had given Sentinel credibility that went beyond Helix's marketing claims. It was now academically validated, peer-reviewed, and publicly documented as a legitimate breakthrough in early detection technology. Conference invitations poured in. Medical schools wanted to include Sentinel case studies in their curricula. International hospital networks expressed interest in licensing the technology. The project Ethan had once feared might be destroyed by legal challenges was instead stronger than ever. On a Saturday afternoon in late April, Ethan found himself at Oliver's school for the spring art show. The hallways were lined with student work, and parents wandered through admiring paintings and sculptures and mixed media projects. Oliver's family portrait was displayed prominently in the second grade section. Victoria had come to the show, standing beside Ethan as they looked at Oliver's rendering of their unconventional family. "He asked me if you and I were going to get married," Ethan said quietly, keeping his eyes on the portrait. Victoria turned to look at him, surprise evident on her face. "What did you tell him?" "That we're friends, that we care about each other, but that doesn't automatically mean romance." "And what do you actually think?" Victoria asked, her tone carefully neutral. Ethan considered the question honestly. Over the past 6 months, Victoria had become one of the most important people in his life. She understood his grief in ways no one else could. She'd given him purpose when he was drowning. She'd believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. And yes, he found her attractive, brilliant, strong, vulnerable in ways she rarely showed anyone else. But was that love? Or was it gratitude and friendship and shared trauma creating the illusion of something deeper? "I think we've both been through too much to rush into anything," Ethan said carefully. I think what we have right now, this partnership, this friendship, is valuable and shouldn't be risked by forcing it into a different shape just because that's what's expected. Victoria nodded slowly. I agree, though I'll admit that what I feel for you is more complicated than simple friendship. You've reminded me that I'm capable of caring about people again, that I don't have to stay frozen to protect myself from future loss. So what do we do with that? Ethan asked. We let it be what it is, Victoria suggested. We don't force it into traditional categories. We build something honest rather than something conventional. She gestured at the portrait. Oliver drew us as family. Maybe that's what we are, in a way that doesn't fit standard definitions but works for us. Ethan looked at the 4 handprints: red, blue, gray, purple. A family built from fragments, held together by choice rather than obligation. I can live with that, he said. Oliver appeared then, dragging them both toward the refreshment table where cookies and juice had been set out. He chattered excitedly about the other projects on display, pointing out his friends' work and explaining the techniques they'd used. Watching his son navigate the social environment with growing confidence, Ethan felt a surge of gratitude. A year ago, Oliver had been withdrawn and struggling, barely able to function under the weight of his grief. Now he was engaged, creative, connected to the world again. They'd both come so far, from the darkness of loss into something that resembled light. The following Monday, Ethan stood in front of the medical technology division team for their quarterly review meeting. The room was packed. The original team had grown to 35 people, with specialists in machine learning, clinical integration, regulatory compliance, and hospital partnerships. We're currently monitoring 42,000 patients across 13 hospital networks, Ethan reported, pulling up the latest dashboard on the main screen. In the past 3 months, Sentinel has flagged 817 potential critical cases. Of those, 693 resulted in early interventions. Our false positive rate has dropped to 8.4%, and more importantly, our false negative rate, cases we should have caught but didn't, is under 2%. The numbers represented thousands of hours of work, countless refinements to the algorithm, extensive training programs, and persistent advocacy with skeptical medical professionals. But they also represented lives saved, families kept intact, tragedies prevented. We've also received preliminary approval from the FDA for expanded use cases, Priya added, clearly excited. Cardiac event prediction, stroke risk assessment, and medication interaction monitoring. We're no longer just a sepsis detection system. We're becoming a comprehensive early warning platform. The team erupted in applause. This was what they'd been working toward, proof that Sentinel's fundamental approach could be applied to multiple critical conditions, multiplying its impact. Victoria, sitting at the back of the room, caught Ethan's eye and nodded with approval. After the meeting, she pulled him aside into her office. The board has approved the budget for international expansion, she said, handing him a folder. We have initial interest from hospital networks in Canada, the UK, and Australia. I'd like you to lead the exploration team, identify the best markets for initial deployment. International expansion. It was a bigger opportunity than Ethan had imagined, but also a bigger responsibility. That would mean significant travel, he said. I'm not sure I can manage that with Oliver. Then bring him, Victoria suggested simply. Summer break is coming up. What 7-year-old wouldn't love seeing London or Sydney? We can structure the trip so it's part business, part family experience. And I'll come with you. Someone needs to handle the business development side, and Oliver shouldn't be alone in hotel rooms while you're in meetings. The proposal was so thoughtful, so perfectly calibrated to address his concerns while advancing the project, that Ethan felt his throat tighten with emotion. You'd do that? Take weeks away from everything here to help me manage international expansion while making sure my kid doesn't feel neglected? I thought we established that we're family, Victoria said, her expression softening. Unconventional, maybe, but family nonetheless. You don't leave family to struggle alone. Ethan found himself pulling her into a hug, the gesture surprising both of them. Victoria stiffened for just a moment, then relaxed, returning the embrace with unexpected warmth. Thank you, Ethan whispered, for everything. For seeing me when I was invisible, for giving me purpose when I'd lost mine, for being here. Thank you for reminding me that life is worth living, Victoria replied quietly. that caring about people is worth the risk of eventual loss. I'd forgotten that until I met you and Oliver. They stood there for a long moment, two people who'd survived the unsurvivable and found unexpected connection in the aftermath. When they finally separated, Victoria's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Well then," she said, her voice slightly unsteady, "I suppose we should start planning this international trip and figure out how to explain to Oliver that he's going on a working vacation with two people who care very deeply about him but aren't quite sure how to define their relationship." "I think he'll be fine with it," Ethan said, smiling. "He's better at accepting unconventional family structures than we are." That evening, when Ethan told Oliver about the upcoming international trip, his son's reaction was exactly what Victoria had predicted. "So we're all going together? You and me and Victoria? Like a family trip?" "Like a business trip that includes family," Ethan corrected gently. "I'll have meetings and presentations, but there will also be time for sightseeing and exploring and having adventures together." "Can we see Buckingham Palace?" "If we go to London, absolutely." Oliver was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Is Victoria part of our family now? For real?" Ethan thought about how to answer. The truth was complicated, built on grief and gratitude and growing affection that didn't fit neat categories. "I think she is," Ethan said finally. "Not in the traditional way, not replacing Mom or trying to be something she's not, but in the way that matters. Someone who cares about us, who we care about, who's chosen to be part of our lives." "Good," Oliver said simply. "I like her, and I think she needs us as much as we need her." Out of the mouths of children came wisdom adults spent years trying to articulate. Oliver understood what Ethan and Victoria were still figuring out. That family was about connection, not convention. That love came in many forms, and the ones built from shared loss and conscious choice were no less valid than the ones sanctioned by tradition. As spring turned to summer, Sentinel continued to expand. The international exploration trip was scheduled for July. The FDA approvals for expanded use cases were progressing through regulatory review. The comprehensive outcomes study was accepted for publication in the Journal of Medical Technology, providing academic validation that opened doors to research partnerships and grant funding. Everything Ethan and his team had worked for was coming to fruition. The vision he'd first sketched out at MedTech Solutions, abandoned due to lack of resources, resurrected by Victoria's determination, and refined through countless hours of development and testing, was now changing healthcare across multiple continents. But on a quiet Tuesday evening in early June, as Ethan sat at his kitchen table helping Oliver with math homework, while Victoria reviewed partnership proposals at the other end of the table, he realized that the professional success wasn't the most important thing he'd gained. The most important thing was this: the ordinary domestic scene of a family doing homework together. The casual comfort of Victoria's presence in his home, no longer a visitor, but a fixture. The sound of Oliver's laughter when he finally solved a difficult problem. The sense that life, despite all its losses and challenges, could still contain moments of genuine contentment. He looked at the family portrait still hanging on the refrigerator, 4 handprints representing a family that shouldn't work but somehow did. "What are you smiling about?" Victoria asked, noticing his expression. "Just thinking about how strange life is," Ethan said. "A year and a half ago, I was sitting in your office expecting to be fired. Now we're planning international expansion and doing homework together and apparently constituting some kind of family unit that would baffle sociologists." "Strange indeed," Victoria agreed, but she was smiling too. "Though I prefer to think of it as adaptive. We've adapted to loss by building something new rather than trying to recreate what was lost." "Is that what we're doing?" Ethan asked. "Isn't it?" Victoria countered. "Neither of us will ever stop grieving Sarah and Elena, but we've learned to carry that grief while still participating in life, while still building connections and taking risks, and believing that good things are possible." Oliver looked up from his homework. "Are you guys being philosophical again? Because it's boring when you do that." They both laughed, and the moment of heavy introspection broke into something lighter. "Sorry, buddy," Ethan said. "Back to math. What's 7 times 8? 56, Oliver answered immediately. "Can we have ice cream when I'm done?" "If you finish your homework without complaining." "I wasn't complaining. I was making an observation about adult conversation being boring." That sounds like complaining to me, Victoria interjected, but her eyes were twinkling. This was family, Ethan thought. Not the sanitized version from television commercials, but the real thing, complicated, imperfect, built from fragments, and held together by choice and commitment and the determination to keep showing up for each other. The professional achievements mattered. Sentinel was saving lives, expanding globally, fulfilling the vision that had driven Ethan through his darkest moments. But this mattered more. The quiet evenings, the shared laughter, the sense of belonging to something larger than himself. He'd started this journey drowning in grief, barely holding on, convinced he was failing at everything that mattered. Now he was leading a division, changing healthcare, and building a family from the wreckage of loss. It wasn't redemption. Nothing could redeem Sarah's death or make it meaningful, but it was transformation. It was choosing to live rather than merely survive. It was honoring the dead by refusing to let grief destroy the living. As Oliver finished his homework and Victoria started scooping ice cream into bowls, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in almost 2 years. Peace. Not the absence of pain, but the ability to hold pain and joy simultaneously, to acknowledge loss while still participating in life. They ate ice cream together, laughing about something silly Oliver said, making plans for the international trip, discussing whether they should get a dog, Oliver's latest obsession. And for that moment, in that kitchen, with those two people who'd become his family through circumstances neither tragic nor simple, Ethan was simply happy. The work would continue. New challenges would arise. Grief would resurface in unexpected moments. But he'd learned that he could weather those storms now. Not alone, but with people who understood, who cared, who'd chosen to build something new from the fragments of what was lost. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The international trip was scheduled to begin in mid-July, but 2 weeks before their departure, Ethan received a call that changed everything. It was late on a Thursday evening. Oliver was already asleep, and Ethan was reviewing implementation reports when his phone rang with an unfamiliar international number. He answered cautiously. "Mr. Cole, this is Dr. James Whitmore from the World Health Organization's Division of Health Systems Innovation. I hope I'm not calling too late." Ethan glanced at the clock. Nearly 10 p.m., which meant it was early morning in Geneva. "Not at all. How can I help you?" "I've been following Sentinel's deployment across North American hospital networks with great interest. The outcomes study your team published was remarkable. We're facing a global crisis with antibiotic-resistant infections and sepsis mortality rates that are catastrophic in lower resource settings. I'd like to discuss the possibility of WHO partnership to bring Sentinel to hospitals in developing nations." The proposal took Ethan's breath away. Sentinel in Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, regions where sepsis mortality was exponentially higher than in developed nations, where a single early detection system could save tens of thousands of lives annually. "That's an incredible opportunity," Ethan said, his mind already racing through the technical challenges. "But the infrastructure requirements are significant. Many hospitals in developing nations don't have the digital health record systems that Sentinel integrates with." "We're aware of the challenges," Dr. Whitmore replied, "but we believe they're surmountable. We'd like to invite you and your team to Geneva next month to discuss potential pathways forward. Would that be possible?" Ethan thought about the planned trip to London and Sydney, about Oliver's excitement at seeing Buckingham Palace, about the business partnerships Victoria had carefully cultivated. But this was different. This was the opportunity to take Sentinel from a successful commercial product to a genuine global health intervention. "Yes," Ethan said, "we can make that work. Let me coordinate with our Chief Innovation Officer and we'll confirm dates." After the call ended, Ethan sat in the quiet apartment, processing what had just happened. The WHO, global deployment, the potential to save not hundreds but thousands of lives. It was everything he'd hoped Sentinel could become, arriving faster than he'd imagined possible. He called Victoria despite the late hour. "This better be important," she answered, her voice thick with sleep. "The WHO wants to partner with us. They want Sentinel deployed in developing nations. They're inviting us to Geneva to discuss implementation." There was a pause, then Victoria's voice came back fully alert. "When?" "Next month. It would conflict with the London and Sydney trip." Then we reschedule London and Sydney, Victoria said without hesitation. This is bigger than commercial expansion. This is the opportunity to make Sentinel what it was always meant to be, a tool that saves lives regardless of economic status or geographic location. They talked for another hour, mapping out the logistics, the technical challenges, the resource requirements. By the time they hung up, Ethan was exhausted but energized. Everything was accelerating, growing beyond what he'd envisioned when he first designed the algorithm at MedTech Solutions. But growth brought vulnerability. 2 days after the WHO call, Ethan's phone rang again. This time, it was Amanda Chen from Helix's legal department, and her tone was grave. Ethan, we have a situation. Richard Brennan has filed a new lawsuit. Not against Helix this time, against you personally. He's alleging that you defamed him during the previous legal dispute and that your public statements damaged his professional reputation. Ethan felt cold wash over him. What public statements? I barely said anything about him. The interview you did with Healthcare Innovation magazine. You referred to his intellectual property claims as baseless accusations from a disgruntled former executive. Brennan's lawyers are arguing that constitutes defamation. Ethan remembered that interview. He'd been frustrated, exhausted from months of legal battles, and when the reporter asked about the IP dispute, he'd spoken bluntly, too bluntly apparently. Can he win? Ethan asked. Probably not. Truth is an absolute defense against defamation, and his claims were objectively baseless. But he can make this painful and expensive. Personal lawsuits are different from corporate ones. This could expose your personal assets, your finances, everything. Everything Ethan had rebuilt over the past 18 months. The stability, the financial security, the ability to provide for Oliver without constant panic, suddenly felt fragile again. What do I do? We fight it, Amanda said. Helix will provide legal representation since the statements were made in your capacity as an executive defending company technology. But Ethan, this is going to get ugly. Brennan is clearly trying to hurt you personally, not just professionally. The lawsuit hit the news within days. Healthcare publications ran stories about the renewed legal battle, questioning whether Sentinel's success had made Ethan arrogant, whether his public statements about critics were appropriate for someone in his position. The scrutiny was intense and personal. Reporters dug into his background, into Sarah's death, into the timeline between her funeral and his promotion at Helix. Some articles implied that he'd used his wife's death as emotional manipulation to advance his career, that Victoria had promoted him out of sympathy rather than merit. Reading those articles felt like being eviscerated. Every private grief, every struggle, every moment of vulnerability he'd experienced was being weaponized by strangers with bylines. Oliver noticed the change in his father's demeanor. You're sad again, Oliver observed one evening as they sat together on the couch. Like you used to be. Did something bad happen? Ethan didn't want to lie, but he also didn't want to burden his 7-year-old son with adult problems. Some people are saying mean things about me at work. It's frustrating, but it'll pass. Like when kids at school said my mom died because I was bad? Oliver asked quietly. The revelation hit Ethan like a physical blow. What? Kids said that to you? Oliver nodded, his eyes downcast. Last year? When I was sad all the time. Some boys said that bad kids make their parents sick, and maybe that's why Mom got sick. I didn't tell you because you were already sad, and I didn't want to make it worse. Ethan pulled his son close, fighting back tears. All this time, Oliver had been carrying that additional burden, that cruel childhood logic that tries to make sense of random tragedy by assigning blame. Listen to me very carefully, Ethan said, his voice shaking with emotion. Mom getting sick had nothing to do with you. Nothing. You were the best thing in her life. She loved you more than anything in the world. And those kids who said that to you were wrong. Completely, absolutely wrong. I know that now, Oliver said. The counselor helped me understand, but it still hurt when they said it. I'm sure it did, just like it hurts when people say mean things about me. But here's what I've learned. People who say hurtful things are usually scared or angry about something else. It's not really about us. It's about them. So the people saying mean things about you are scared? Maybe? Or maybe they're just wrong, like those kids were wrong about you. Either way, we don't let them define us. We know who we are. We know we're doing good work. That's what matters. Oliver considered this, then asked, "Is Victoria going to help you, like she helped when the other bad man tried to stop Sentinel?" "Yes, she is. We help each other when things get hard. That's what family does." The word family had started coming more naturally to all of them. Victoria was a fixture in their lives now, joining them for dinners several times a week, attending Oliver's school events, even keeping spare clothes at Ethan's apartment for the nights when planning meetings ran late, and it made more sense to stay over rather than drive home. Their relationship had evolved into something Ethan still struggled to define. They weren't romantic partners. There had been no declarations of love, no physical intimacy beyond occasional hugs and the comfortable proximity of people who spent significant time together. But they were more than friends or colleagues. They were partners in the fullest sense, co-parenting Oliver, co-leading the medical technology division, co-navigating the challenges of lives rebuilt from tragedy. Victoria's response to the lawsuit was characteristically fierce. She called a press conference, something Helix rarely did, and stood before a room full of reporters with Ethan beside her. "I'm going to make a statement, and then we'll take a limited number of questions," Victoria began, her voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. Richard Brennan's lawsuit against Ethan Cole is a transparent attempt to damage a person whose only crime was speaking truthfully about baseless legal claims. Mr. Cole called those claims baseless because they were baseless. That's not defamation. That's accuracy. She pulled up a slide showing Sentinel's deployment statistics, patient outcomes, and the comprehensive academic study that had validated the technology. While Mr. Brennan has been filing frivolous lawsuits, Sentinel has saved over 800 lives. 800 people are alive today because Ethan Cole designed a system that detects infections before they become fatal. 800 families didn't have to experience the grief that Mr. Cole experienced when he lost his wife to sepsis. That's what this technology does. That's what this man has accomplished. Victoria's voice grew quieter but more intense. "I've known Ethan Cole for 18 months. In that time, I've watched him balance single parenthood with professional excellence. I've watched him pour everything he has into building something meaningful from tragedy. I've watched him demonstrate more integrity and dedication than any executive I've worked with in my entire career. And I've watched him endure personal attacks that would break most people. Yet he continues showing up, continues fighting for this technology, continues believing that healthcare can be better." She paused, looking directly at the cameras. "Helix Innovation stands completely behind Ethan Cole. We will defend him vigorously against these spurious claims. And we will not be distracted from our mission of deploying life-saving technology to hospitals around the world. Mr. Brennan can file all the lawsuits he wants. We'll be too busy saving lives to pay much attention." The press conference became the story instead of the lawsuit. Victoria's passionate defense of Ethan shifted the narrative from scandal to inspiration. Patient advocacy groups rallied behind Sentinel. Medical professionals who'd seen the system work published open letters supporting Ethan. The WHO released a statement affirming their partnership discussions and expressing confidence in Sentinel's leadership team. Within a week, public opinion had turned decisively against Brennan. His lawsuit was revealed for what it was, a vindictive attack by someone who couldn't accept that he'd been on the wrong side of history. But the most unexpected support came from an unusual source. Dr. Richard Howell, the physician from St. Catherine's, whose dismissal of a Sentinel alert had nearly cost a patient his life, published an editorial in a major medical journal. "I made a mistake," Howell wrote. "I let skepticism override data. I let professional pride interfere with patient safety. And because of that mistake, a man nearly died. But the Sentinel system didn't fail. The algorithm detected what I missed. It did exactly what it was designed to do. Ethan Cole built something that made me a better doctor, even when I was too stubborn to recognize it. Attacking him for defending that technology isn't just wrong, it's dangerous. It sends a message that innovation should be timid, that speaking honestly about obstacles and critics is unacceptable. That's not the kind of healthcare system I want to be part of." The editorial went viral in medical circles. Other physicians who'd initially been skeptical of Sentinel but had come to appreciate its value added their voices. The story transformed from a legal scandal into a referendum on innovation versus obstruction, truth versus vindictiveness. Brennan's lawsuit collapsed under the weight of public opposition. His attorneys withdrew the claim within 3 weeks of filing it, citing irreconcilable differences with the client. Translation: even his own lawyers had abandoned him once it became clear the case was hopeless. But the damage to Brennan's reputation was permanent. He became a cautionary tale in healthcare technology circles, the executive who'd let ego and resentment override judgment, who'd tried to sabotage life-saving innovation and ended up destroying his own credibility instead. Ethan felt no satisfaction in Brennan's downfall. If anything, he felt pity. Brennan had wasted years of his life on revenge instead of moving forward, had poisoned his own future with bitterness. It was a reminder of how grief and loss could be channeled in vastly different directions, toward creation or destruction, toward purpose or resentment. The Geneva trip was scheduled for late August. Ethan, Victoria, and Oliver flew together, the boys' excitement at international travel infectious enough to lift the adults' spirits despite the intense work ahead. The WHO headquarters was imposing, a modern building filled with people from every corner of the globe, all dedicated to improving health outcomes for the world's most vulnerable populations. Dr. Whitmore greeted them warmly, a silver-haired man in his 60s with the calm authority of someone who'd spent decades navigating international health bureaucracy. Mr. Cole, Miss Cross, welcome to Geneva, and you must be Oliver. He shook the boy's hand with the seriousness one adult extends to another. Your father is doing very important work. You should be proud of him. I am, Oliver said simply. He helps sick people get better before they get really sick. That's exactly right, Dr. Whitmore said, smiling, and we want to help him do that for even more people. The meetings were intense. WHO officials outlined the staggering scope of sepsis mortality in lower resource settings. Over 5 million deaths annually, the majority in regions without access to advanced medical technology. They also outlined the challenges: limited digital infrastructure, shortage of trained medical personnel, lack of reliable electricity in many rural hospitals. We can't deploy Sentinel as it currently exists, one official pointed out. The system requires constant network connectivity, integration with electronic health records, and trained staff to interpret alerts. Many of the hospitals we're targeting have none of those things. It was a fair criticism, and one Ethan had anticipated, but instead of seeing it as an insurmountable obstacle, he saw it as an engineering challenge. Then we build a version that doesn't require those things, Ethan proposed. A standalone system that can operate offline, that stores data locally and syncs when connectivity is available. We simplify the interface so it doesn't require extensive training. We design it for low-resource environments from the ground up. That's essentially building an entirely new system, Priya objected. She joined them for the technical discussions. The development timeline would be years. Oh, not if we leverage the core algorithm and rebuild everything around it, Marcus countered. He'd come to Geneva as well, his expertise in system architecture critical for these conversations. The pattern recognition doesn't change. We just need different input methods and output interfaces. 6 months of focused development, maybe a year if we're conservative. Dr. Whitmore leaned forward. And if WHO provided funding and resources, if we made this a priority partnership, then we could accelerate significantly, Ethan said, his excitement building. This is exactly the kind of challenge we need to solve. Technology that only works in wealthy hospitals with perfect infrastructure isn't good enough. We need technology that works everywhere. The discussions continued over 3 days, evolving from theoretical possibilities to concrete plans. WHO would provide initial funding for development of what they were calling Sentinel Global Edition. Helix would contribute technical expertise and project management. They'd conduct pilot programs in 3 countries, Kenya, Bangladesh, and Guatemala, testing the system in diverse low-resource environments before scaling globally. On their final evening in Geneva, Victoria took Ethan and Oliver to a small restaurant overlooking Lake Geneva. The sun was setting, painting the water in shades of gold and orange, the Alps visible in the distance. This is bigger than I ever imagined, Ethan said quietly, watching Oliver point excitedly at swans gliding across the lake. When I designed the original algorithm, I was thinking about a few hospitals, maybe a regional network if we were lucky. Now we're talking about global deployment, millions of lives potentially saved. Sarah would be proud, Victoria said, then paused, I hope that's not inappropriate to say. It's not, Ethan assured her. She always believed medicine should be accessible to everyone, not just people who could afford premium health care. This is exactly what she would have wanted. Elena too, Victoria added softly. She used to talk about joining Doctors Without Borders when she finished medical school. She wanted to go where the need was greatest. This feels like honoring that dream. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sunset, while Oliver chattered about the swans and asked if they could get ice cream afterward. The scene was peaceful, almost domestic, a family enjoying a quiet moment together. I've been thinking about what happens next, Victoria said eventually. After we launch Sentinel Global, after we've implemented it across WHO partner hospitals, after we've achieved everything we set out to accomplish. What do you mean? Ethan asked, though he suspected he knew. I mean, the medical technology division has grown beyond what either of us anticipated. We have 3 major product lines in development, partnerships across 4 continents, a team of over 80 people. It's become its own entity, really, independent of Helix's original business model. Are you suggesting we spin it off? Victoria nodded. As a separate organization, a foundation maybe, focused specifically on developing accessible health technology for underserved populations. Helix could retain partial ownership, but the mission would be different, not profit-driven, but impact-driven. The idea resonated deeply. Ethan thought about the corporate pressures that had killed Sentinel at MedTech Solutions, the constant tension between quarterly earnings and long-term vision. A foundation could prioritize patient outcomes over shareholder returns, could take risks that traditional companies couldn't justify. We'd need funding, Ethan said, thinking through the logistics. We'd have funding, Victoria countered. Philanthropic organizations are desperate to fund proven interventions. We have data showing Sentinel saves lives cost-effectively. Every major global health foundation would want to be part of scaling it, and we could partner with governments, WHO, academic institutions. The funding would come. You've really thought this through. I've thought about little else for the past 2 months, Victoria admitted. I didn't escape the CEO role at Helix just to build another corporate division. I want to build something that matters, something Elena would have been proud of, something that changes the fundamental equation of who gets to access life-saving healthcare. Ethan looked at Oliver, who was now trying to feed breadcrumbs to the swans despite a sign clearly stating that feeding wildlife was prohibited. His son, growing, healing, learning to be happy again despite carrying grief that no 7-year-old should have to bear. If we do this, it's a long-term commitment, Ethan said. Years of our lives, maybe decades. Are you prepared for that? Are you? Victoria challenged gently. Ethan thought about the question seriously. A year and a half ago, he couldn't have imagined committing to anything beyond the next day's survival. Now he was contemplating dedicating the rest of his career to a single mission. The transformation was almost incomprehensible. Yes, he said finally. I think I am. I think this is what I'm supposed to be doing, what we're supposed to be doing. Victoria smiled, the expression warm and genuine. Then let's do it. Let's build something worthy of the people we've lost and the people we're trying to save. They toasted with wine, while Oliver toasted with lemonade, the boy delighted to be included in what was clearly an important adult moment, even if he didn't fully understand it. The flight back to the United States felt different. They were returning not just from a successful trip, but from a pivotal decision point. Everything was about to change again, transform into something larger and more ambitious. Over the following months, the plans took shape. Helix's board approved the spin-off, recognizing that the medical technology division had grown beyond their core expertise. A new entity was established, the Global Health Innovation Foundation, with Victoria as executive director and Ethan as chief technology officer. Funding commitments came in from 3 major philanthropic organizations, impressed by Sentinel's documented impact and excited about the global expansion vision. The Foundation's mission was elegant in its simplicity: develop and deploy accessible health technology to reduce preventable deaths in all populations, regardless of economic status or geographic location. Sentinel Global Edition was developed over 8 months of intensive work. Marcus led a team that rebuilt the system from the ground up, designing it to work with minimal infrastructure. to operate offline for extended periods, to provide alerts through simple interfaces that didn't require extensive medical knowledge to understand. The pilot programs launched in January. Kenya first, at a regional hospital outside Nairobi that served over 200,000 people but had limited resources and chronic understaffing. Then Bangladesh, at a facility in Dhaka that handled massive patient volumes with equipment decades old. Finally, Guatemala, at a rural hospital where electricity was intermittent and internet connectivity sporadic. The results exceeded every projection. Sentinel Global Edition worked even better in resource-limited settings than the original had in wealthy hospitals. Why? Because in facilities where staff were overwhelmed and expertise stretched thin, any tool that provided early warning of developing problems became immediately valuable. There was no skepticism to overcome, no resistance from doctors who felt their judgment was being questioned, just desperate gratitude for help in any form. Within 6 months, the 3 pilot sites had collectively flagged over 400 potential critical cases. Early intervention rates approached 90%. Mortality rates dropped by more than half compared to historical averages. The WHO fast-tracked approval for broader deployment. By the end of the Foundation's second year, Sentinel was operating in 42 countries, monitoring over 250,000 patients in low-resource settings. The lives saved were no longer countable in hundreds, but in thousands. Mothers who survived childbirth complications because infections were caught early, children who recovered from illnesses that would have killed them without timely intervention, elderly patients who lived years longer than they would have in the absence of the technology. Each save was documented, verified, added to the growing body of evidence that accessible technology could fundamentally change health outcomes for the world's poorest populations. But success brought new challenges. The Foundation grew rapidly, expanding beyond Sentinel to develop other technologies, portable diagnostic tools, AI-assisted triage systems, medication management platforms. Staff increased to over 200 people. Offices opened in Geneva, Nairobi, and Delhi. The organization Ethan and Victoria had imagined as a focused intervention became a major player in global health technology. Managing that growth while maintaining their core mission required constant vigilance. There were pressure from funders to expand faster than was sustainable. Pressure from governments to customize systems for political rather than medical reasons. Pressure from pharmaceutical companies seeking partnerships that would benefit their bottom lines more than patient outcomes. Ethan and Victoria navigated these challenges together, their partnership now tested and proven through years of shared work. They'd learned to balance each other's strengths and compensate for each other's weaknesses. Where Ethan sometimes got lost in technical details, Victoria maintained strategic focus. Where Victoria occasionally became too rigid in her decision-making, Ethan provided flexibility and creativity. And through it all, Oliver grew. He turned 8, then 9, then 10. The grief that had defined his early childhood became just one part of a richer, more complex emotional landscape. He still missed his mother, would always miss her, but he'd also built a life that included Victoria, that included understanding his father's important work, that included pride in being part of a family that was doing something meaningful in the world. On the second anniversary of the Foundation's establishment, they held a celebration at the main office. Staff from around the world had flown in for the event. Hospitals that had implemented Sentinel sent video messages thanking the team. Patients whose lives had been saved appeared in person to share their stories. A young woman from Kenya spoke about the post-surgical infection that Sentinel had caught when she was 17. "I wanted to be a doctor," she said, her voice steady and clear. "But I thought that dream died when I got sick. The doctors in my village said I probably wouldn't survive. But this system, this technology that you built, gave me a chance. And now I'm in my second year of medical school. I'm going to be a doctor because you saved my life." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Ethan felt Victoria reach for his hand, squeezing it tightly as they listened to story after story of lives transformed, futures reclaimed, tragedies prevented. During his speech, Ethan spoke about Sarah for the first time publicly since the early days of Sentinel's development. "My wife died because the medical system failed to catch an infection in time," he said, his voice carrying across the crowded room. For a long time, I was angry about that failure. Angry at the doctors, at the hospital, at the randomness of disease, but anger doesn't save lives. Building better systems saves lives. Creating technology that helps overwhelmed medical professionals make better decisions saves lives. Ensuring that technology is accessible to everyone, not just those who can afford premium healthcare, saves lives. He paused, looking out at the faces watching him. The engineers and doctors and project managers and funders who'd all contributed to building something extraordinary. Sarah didn't die so that Sentinel could exist. Her death wasn't meaningful or redemptive or part of some plan. She died because an infection overwhelmed her immune system and the medical interventions came too late. That's all. But what we've built in the aftermath of that loss, that is meaningful. The thousands of people who are alive today because of this technology, that is redemptive. Not for Sarah, who can't be brought back, but for the families who won't experience what my son and I experienced. That's what makes this work worth everything we've put into it. The applause was thunderous. People stood, cheering not just for the technology, but for the mission, for the transformation of private grief into public good, for the proof that tragedy could be the catalyst for extraordinary positive change without requiring the tragedy itself to have been necessary or meaningful. Later that evening, after the formal celebrations had ended and most attendees had departed, Ethan found himself on the building's rooftop terrace with Victoria and Oliver. The city stretched out below them, millions of lights representing millions of lives, each one precious and fragile and deserving of the best care possible. "Your speech was beautiful," Victoria said quietly. "Sarah would have been proud." "I hope so," Ethan replied. "Though, honestly, I think she'd be more proud of Oliver than of me. Look at him." Oliver was leaning against the railing, looking out at the city with the contemplative expression of someone older than his 10 years. He'd grown tall, his features starting to show hints of the teenager he'd become, but he still carried his stuffed rabbit with him on important occasions, still needed reassurance before big events, still asked questions about his mother that Ethan answered as honestly as he could. "I've been thinking about the future," Victoria said, "about what happens as the foundation continues to grow, about whether we're building something sustainable or just riding momentum that will eventually falter." "You're worried we've overextended?" Ethan asked. "I'm worried we've built something that depends too much on us," Victoria clarified. "On our specific partnership, our shared vision, our personal commitment. What happens when we're not here anymore? Does the foundation continue or does it collapse?" It was a fair concern. They'd built the organization around their partnership, their complementary skills, their shared understanding of what the mission meant. Replacing that would be difficult. "Then we build institutional structures that don't depend on individuals," Ethan suggested. "We develop leadership pipelines, establish clear governance processes, create systems that can outlast their founders. That's what great organizations do. They transcend their creators." "Easier said than done," Victoria pointed out. "Most foundations become monuments to their founders' egos rather than vehicles for continued impact." "Then we'll be different," Ethan said simply. "We'll build something that's designed to evolve beyond us, something that serves the mission rather than serving our need to be important." Victoria smiled at that. "Still the idealist, even after everything we've been through." "Someone has to be," Ethan replied. "You're too practical to let us drift into fantasy. I'm too idealistic to let us settle for mediocrity. Together we managed to hit somewhere near excellence." "Is that what we are? Excellent?" Victoria's tone was teasing, but also genuinely curious. Ethan thought about the question. The foundation had saved thousands of lives. Sentinel was deployed across 4 continents. They'd transformed global health technology in measurable, documented ways. By any objective standard, what they'd built was exceptional. But the real excellence, Ethan thought, wasn't in the professional achievements. It was in how they'd rebuilt their lives after devastating loss, how they'd created a family that didn't fit conventional molds but provided genuine love and support, how they'd transformed grief into purpose without diminishing the reality of what they'd lost. "Yeah," he said finally, "I think we are. Not perfect, but excellent. That's enough." Oliver turned from the railing. "Can we go home now? I'm tired, and tomorrow is my soccer game, and you both promised you'd be there." "We'll be there," Ethan and Victoria said simultaneously, then laughed at the synchronized response. The soccer game the next morning was exactly the kind of ordinary family event that Ethan had once thought would never be part of his life again. He and Victoria sat in folding chairs on the sideline, cheering as Oliver played midfielder with focused determination. Other parents chatted around them, and for the first time, Ethan didn't feel separate from that community. He felt part of it, just another parent watching their kid play sports on a Saturday morning. After the game, Oliver's team won 3-2, with Oliver assisting on the final goal. They went out for lunch at a diner Oliver loved. The boy was animated, recounting every moment of the game, explaining strategies that seemed overly complex for 10-year-olds, but that he took very seriously. "You're really good," Victoria told him. "Have you thought about joining a competitive league?" "Maybe," Oliver said, "but I also want to do the science club at school, and I'm thinking about volunteering at the hospital where you work. Dr. Riley said I could help with patient welcome packets once I'm old enough." Ethan felt his heart swell with pride. His son was thinking about helping others, about contributing to something beyond himself. The empathy that grief could have destroyed had instead been cultivated and nurtured. "I think volunteering is a wonderful idea," Ethan said. "When you're ready, we'll set it up." That afternoon, back at home, Oliver disappeared into his room to work on a school project while Ethan and Victoria sat at the kitchen table with coffee, reviewing foundation business on their laptops. It was a scene that had been repeated hundreds of times over the past 3 years. Work and life blending seamlessly, professional and personal, inseparable. "I got an interesting email this morning," Victoria said, turning her laptop so Ethan could see. "From a reporter working on a long-form piece about families that have rebuilt after tragedy. She wants to interview us. All 3 of us." Ethan read the email carefully. The reporter was from a major national magazine, and the piece she was proposing would focus on how people create meaning and connection in the aftermath of devastating loss. It would be high-profile, personal, potentially invasive. "What do you think?" he asked. "I think it depends on Oliver," Victoria said. "He's old enough now that his opinion matters. If he's comfortable being part of that story, then maybe we should tell it. If he's not, we decline politely and move on." They called Oliver out from his room and explained the request. He listened carefully, his expression thoughtful. "Would I have to talk about Mom?" he asked. "Probably, if you agreed to participate," Ethan said. "But you'd only say what you're comfortable saying. And if at any point you wanted to stop, we'd stop." Oliver was quiet for a long moment. "Would it help other kids? Kids who lost their parents?" "It might," Victoria said gently. "Some people find it helpful to hear how others have dealt with similar losses. It makes them feel less alone." "Then, okay," Oliver decided. "I'll do it. But can I bring Mr. Rabbit? He helps when things are hard." Mr. Rabbit was the stuffed animal that had been with Oliver through everything. His mother's illness, the funeral, the long nights of grief, the gradual healing. He was worn now, patched in several places, one ear slightly misshapen from being clutched too tightly, but he remained a source of comfort. "Of course you can bring Mr. Rabbit," Ethan said, pulling his son into a hug. The interview took place 3 weeks later at their home. The reporter, a woman in her 40s named Claire Morrison, was kind and professional, putting Oliver at ease immediately. She asked thoughtful questions, listened carefully to their answers, and never pushed when they indicated certain topics were off limits. Oliver spoke about his mother with surprising eloquence for a 10-year-old. He talked about missing her, but also about learning that families could change shape and still be families. He talked about grief being something you carried rather than something you got over. And he talked about being proud of his dad and Victoria for building something that helped people. When Claire asked Oliver to describe his family, he thought for a moment, then pulled out the family portrait he'd made years ago in 2nd grade, 4 handprints in red, blue, gray, and purple. "This is my family," Oliver explained. "Red is me, blue is Dad, gray is Victoria, and purple is Mom. She's not here anymore, but she's still part of us. Family isn't just who lives with you, it's who loves you and who you love back." Claire turned to Ethan and Victoria. "And how would you two describe your relationship? You're clearly partners in work and co-parents to Oliver, but I'm curious how you think about what you are to each other." It was a question they'd never quite resolved between themselves, let alone articulated to outsiders. Ethan and Victoria exchanged glances, each waiting for the other to answer. Finally, Victoria spoke. We're partners in every meaningful sense. We've built a life together, built a family together, built an organization together. We've supported each other through grief and success and everything in between. If you need a label, I suppose you could call us life partners. The specifics of the relationship matter less than the commitment and care we have for each other. Do you ever think you'll marry? Claire asked. Maybe someday, Ethan said. Or maybe not. The legal formality feels less important than the actual relationship. We're already committed to each other and to Oliver in every way that matters. A marriage certificate would be symbolic rather than transformative. The article was published 2 months later under the title, After Loss, How 3 People Built a Family from Fragments. It was beautiful and honest, capturing their story without sensationalizing it. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of people reached out, grieving parents, bereaved spouses, anyone who'd experienced loss and was struggling to find a path forward. Some were looking for practical advice about managing grief while raising children. Others wanted to know more about Sentinel and the Foundation's work. Many just wanted to say thank you for sharing a story that made them feel less alone. Reading those messages, Ethan realized that their personal journey had become something larger than themselves. They'd become proof that life could continue after devastation, that families could be built from unconventional pieces, that purpose could emerge from pain. On what would have been Sarah's 40th birthday, Ethan took Oliver to the cemetery. They'd established a tradition of visiting on significant days: Sarah's birthday, the anniversary of her death, Mother's Day. But these visits had become less painful over time, evolving from raw grief into gentle remembrance. They brought flowers and sat on the grass near her headstone. Oliver told his mother about school, about soccer, about the science project he was working on. Ethan talked about the Foundation's latest expansion, about the lives Sentinel was saving, about how much he wished she could see what they'd built. I think she knows, Oliver said confidently. Not in a magic way, but because the work you're doing, it's what she would have wanted. So in a way, she's still part of it. Ethan looked at his son, marveling at the wisdom that had emerged from such profound loss. Oliver would carry scars from his mother's death for the rest of his life, but he'd also carry strength, empathy, and a deep understanding that life was precious and fragile and worth fighting for. You're right, Ethan said. She's still part of everything we do. That evening, Victoria joined them for dinner. It was a tradition now. On days that centered around Sarah's memory, Victoria made sure to be present, offering support without trying to replace what was lost. They cooked together, the 3 of them working in comfortable synchronicity that came from years of practice. After Oliver went to bed, Ethan and Victoria sat on the back porch with wine, looking up at the stars. Do you ever regret how your life turned out? Ethan asked quietly. I mean, you could have stayed CEO of Helix, could have built an empire, maximized your wealth and power. Instead, you're running a nonprofit, dealing with bureaucratic obstacles and funding challenges. No regrets, Victoria said firmly. CEO was a role I played to avoid dealing with Elena's death. It was successful, yes, but it was also empty. What we have now, the foundation, the mission, this family, it's real. It matters. I'd choose this over any amount of corporate success. Even though it means working twice as hard for less money and more frustration. Even then, Victoria confirmed, Ethan, when Elena died, I thought my capacity for joy died with her. I thought the best I could do was survive, achieve professionally, keep myself too busy to feel. You and Oliver proved me wrong. You showed me that connection was still possible, that caring about people was worth the risk of eventual loss. She turned to look at him directly. I love you. Not romantically, necessarily, though there's affection and attraction mixed in there, but deeply, completely, in a way that encompasses friendship, and partnership, and family. You're one of the most important people in my life, and I'm grateful every day that you walked into my office terrified of being fired. Ethan felt tears prick his eyes. They'd never quite said the words to each other before, had skirted around the depth of their feelings with euphemisms and practical language. Hearing Victoria speak with such raw honesty was both overwhelming and exactly right. "I love you too," he said. "You saved my life in a very literal way. I was drowning, and you threw me a rope. But more than that, you became family. You gave Oliver and me a future when all we could see was emptiness. Whatever label we put on that, partner, friend, family, the feeling underneath is love." They sat in silence for a while, the words hanging between them like a blessing. It wasn't a romantic declaration leading to a proposal. It was something deeper, a recognition of connection that transcended conventional categories. The years that followed were full and purposeful. The foundation continued expanding, Sentinel reaching more countries, saving more lives. New technologies were developed and deployed. Oliver grew into a thoughtful teenager who volunteered at hospitals and talked about studying medicine. Ethan and Victoria navigated the challenges of organizational leadership while maintaining the personal connection that made their partnership work. There were hard moments, funding crises that threatened programs, technical failures that cost lives, political obstacles that delayed implementations. But they weathered each challenge together, their bond strengthening through shared struggle. On the 10-year anniversary of Sarah's death, Ethan stood in a conference room filled with Foundation staff from around the world. They were celebrating a milestone. Sentinel had now been deployed in over 100 countries, had monitored more than 3 million patients, and had contributed to over 50,000 documented early interventions. 50,000 lives. 50,000 people who'd gone home to their families instead of ending up in morgues. 50,000 stories that hadn't ended in tragedy because an algorithm noticed patterns that human observers missed. "We built this because we understand loss," Ethan told the gathered staff. "Every person in this room has been touched by preventable tragedy in some way. We know what it feels like when the system fails, and we've dedicated ourselves to making those failures less common, less inevitable, less acceptable." He pulled up a slide showing photographs. Patients who'd survived because of Sentinel, children who'd kept their parents, parents who'd kept their children, families kept intact by early intervention. These are the faces of success, not corporate profits or market share or technological innovation. These people, these families, this is what we're fighting for. The room erupted in applause, but Ethan held up his hand for quiet. 10 years ago, I couldn't have imagined this moment. I was barely functional, barely surviving, convinced I was failing at everything that mattered. What changed wasn't that the grief went away. What changed was that I found purpose in the grief, found people to share the burden, found a way to transform pain into something constructive. He looked at Victoria, standing at the back of the room, and at Oliver, now 17 and interning with the Foundation during his summer break. "I've learned that family isn't defined by biology or law or convention. It's defined by commitment, by showing up, by choosing to care for each other even when it's difficult. The family I've built with Victoria and Oliver doesn't replace what I lost, but it proves that loss doesn't have to be the end of the story. We can build new chapters, create new connections, find new sources of joy without diminishing the reality of what we've lost." After the presentation, as staff mingled and celebrated, Oliver pulled Ethan aside. "I've been thinking about something," Oliver said, his expression serious. "I'm going to college next year, and I've been trying to figure out what I want to study. I think I want to go into public health. Not exactly what you do, but related. I want to work on making healthcare more accessible, more equitable." Ethan felt pride swell in his chest. His son had taken the lessons of their journey and was building his own path forward, his own way of making meaning from loss. "Your mother would be so proud," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud." "It's because of what you and Victoria built," Oliver said. "You showed me that you can take the worst thing that ever happened to you and use it to make the world better. That's what I want to do too." That night, the three of them, Ethan, Victoria, and Oliver, sat together in the home they'd shared for nearly a decade. It was a modest house, comfortable but not extravagant, filled with the accumulated artifacts of a life built together. The family portrait Oliver had made in second grade still hung in the kitchen, slightly faded but still meaningful. "I got an email from the Nobel Committee," Victoria said casually, though her eyes were sparkling with suppressed excitement. Ethan's head snapped up. "What?" "The Foundation has been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. for our work expanding access to life-saving healthcare technology in conflict zones and low-resource settings. That's incredible, Ethan breathed. Are we going to win? Who knows? But the nomination itself is validation, recognition that what we've built matters on a global scale. They talked late into the night about what the nomination meant, about the platform it would provide to advocate for health equity, about the additional funding and partnerships it might unlock. But underneath the practical discussions was something deeper, the recognition that they'd succeeded beyond their wildest imaginings. Not just in building a successful organization, though they had, not just in saving lives, though they'd saved thousands, but in proving that tragedy didn't have to be the defining fact of their existence. That loss could coexist with love, that grief could coexist with joy, that the worst moments of life could be transformed into catalysts for extraordinary good. As Ethan lay in bed that night, listening to the quiet sounds of the house, Oliver moving around in his room, Victoria washing dishes in the kitchen, he thought about the journey that had brought him here. From the devastating loss of Sarah to the terrifying summons to Victoria's office, from barely surviving to building something that saved lives around the world, from a broken, grieving man to a leader, a father, a partner in a family that defied conventional definition but worked perfectly for them. The grief hadn't disappeared. He still missed Sarah with an ache that would never fully heal. But the grief had been integrated into a larger life, no longer the only thing he felt but one emotion among many. And that, Ethan realized, was the real victory. Not defeating grief, that was impossible, but learning to carry it alongside hope, purpose, love, and the quiet contentment of a life well lived. He fell asleep thinking about tomorrow, about the Foundation's expansion into new regions, about Oliver's college applications, about the conversation he and Victoria needed to have about succession planning as they both approached their 50s, about all the ordinary and extraordinary moments that would make up the rest of his life. The story that had begun with loss had become a story of transformation, of family forged from fragments, of purpose built from pain, of lives saved and futures reclaimed and the stubborn, beautiful persistence of hope even in the darkest moments. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything.